24th annual Minicon. It's going to be a great day. So I'm very excited to see all the lovely second years give their fun talks. And Shuyi, take it away.
Thanks, Alyssa. So just before we get started, we just want to point out a couple of things. So the chat box is open for you to all, type your comments, give your support to all the second years. So feel free to do that. And then this year's Minicon was put on together by the third years. So we have Courtney and Sarah who did the graphics design. So if you see their lovely pamphlets, all the credit goes to them and like the website. And then today we have our logistics team, May and Paige, who will be helping with the timing of the talks. And then they'll also be helping with asking the questions. And then lastly, we have our MCs, Vicky and Jordan, who will, run the show for today. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to them to introduce themselves.
I can get started. Sorry, there is a cat playing with a toy right now. My name is Vicky. I am very often confused with Paige, and I'll also respond to Paige. So, yep, I'm a third year. I don't really know what else to say about myself.
Hello, I'm Jordan. I am a third year as well in the attention lab. And that's about all that's interesting about me. I'm glad to be here, and I'm honored to be at MC, and I'm excited to see all these talks. So yeah. Are we handing it over?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Is Mike doing the intro? Are we handing it over to Mike?
Also, yes.
Okay. So I don't have the power to promote Mike, but Mike would like to say a few words. Oh,
Okay, I think I'm online, but I'm going to act like I am online. So hopefully you can see and hear me. I can see a couple of nods and thumbs up. So great. So welcome everybody. This is the 44th annual Minicon, which is just unbelievable. 44 years this department has been doing this, and I was just thinking, 44 years ago would be 1977, which is a long time ago. I mean, it's 1977. Rich Mayer was a young assistant professor in this department, which is, just hard to imagine. I mean, Rich with probably a full head of hair and a mustache, and probably eager as all heck. He's probably such an eager young faculty member. I'm sure it was quite annoying, but who knew he would be so famous one day. But yeah, that's this is a long tradition in our department. It's something I think all of us cherish. I know it's one of the favorite events for our faculty. And it's just, it's great to be able to hear about the work of our second year students. And, it's also just a great way to, to see what's going on in the different labs. I think even for some faculty, it's probably good for them to see what's going on in their own lab. But it's a really sort of an inspiring event for a lot of us. But I did want to just talk a little bit about this year's group of second year graduate students, because this is a very unique and special group, given the circumstances. And 20 months ago, this group of students began as graduate students, and then 5 months later, we were hit with a shutdown and a pandemic, and it really impacted all of us, of course. I mean, it was a huge challenge. I know for me, working in Evan Lair's lab, seriously, like, the guy's just out of control. But it's it was a big hit, and had to make some major adjustments and learn to do everything remotely. And find a place to work and you know, try to think of creative ways to kind of keep all of our work going. But you know, I was trying to imagine what it must have been like for, you know, for our second year students that had just been here only 5 months, you know, probably eager to get going and to get going in the lab and get to know your lab mates. And you probably just moved out here. I know some of you moved from far away, from like Malaysia and India and other places to come to Santa Barbara. So you're probably just feeling your way around and excited about, you know, the future. And then suddenly you had to shut down. And, you know, you may be living with a roommate and now you got to find a place to work. And I think really, you know, for you guys, you know, for our graduate students who really had taken the brunt of this pandemic and the shutdown, because it, you know, you are the engines that keep our labs going, and now suddenly you had to find creative ways to get around this. How are you going to do human subject testing now? And you know, and not only that, but you're the TAs in the classes here on the front lines with our undergraduate students who, you know, I'm sure have been quite anxious, and you've had to be on the front line dealing with their anxieties and trying to get them through this as well. So, but you know, you've persevered, and it's just so great and inspiring to see and hear today about the work that you've done in this 20 months since you've been here. And this is just I think for me, it's just very invigorating to hear about this and to see this, and I'm sure it is for all the rest of the faculty. So I'm not going to make any false promises this year. No pizza coupon things. I know Jordan's been badgering me about that for the past year. We'll just try to make it up to you when we can all be together again and celebrate your achievements in person. But without further ado, let's get the program started. Thank you.
Everybody. Okay, so I am going to introduce our first speaker, but before I do that, I just wanted to let everybody know to please write in the Q&A section for questions, and don't put any questions in the chat box. Okay, if anyone has any questions about that, you can type the questions in the Q&A box and not the chat box, and then we can answer them. All right. So our first presenter, can you all see my screen okay? Okay, our first presenter is Ben Gelbart. Ben got his bachelor's in psychological science from Arizona State University in 2017. He now works with Dan Conroy Beam and utilizes computational methods in his approach to understanding human mating psychology. So my fun fact about Ben is going to be the contents of his 4 fish tanks. So I will read the names and the species, I guess, of the fish. So Pete Buttigieg and Justin Trudeau, who are 2 beta fish. There are some unnamed neon tetras, some black neon tetras named Elizabeth, Charles, and William, some celestial pearl danios named Nancy, Chuck, and Patrick, Japanese rice fish, a dwarf gourami named Kamala Harris, a honey gourami named Boris Johnson, a sparkling gourami named Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, an unnamed ghost shrimp and cherry shrimp, various unnamed snails, and a dwarf puffer named Mrs. Puff. So those are all the contents of his 4 fish tanks. So Ben, if your presentation is anything like your fish tank, it's going to go swimmingly. I apologize for the very bad joke. And yeah, take it away, Ben.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Okay, let me share my screen. Can everyone see my screen? Okay. Okay. Should I get started? Okay. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you guys about a couple, two different models of romantic love that we tested across a series of studies. So romantic love is ubiquitous around the world, but it's not entirely clear what, if anything, love is designed to accomplish. One possible answer comes from the commitment device model. And according to the commitment device model, love is designed to motivate commitment in a world of romantic alternatives. So according to the model, most people will inevitably find a romantic alternative who is smarter, kinder, funnier, or just otherwise more desirable than their current partner. A perfectly rational agent would leave upon discovering nearly any superior alternative who's also mutually interested. The problem with this is that many of the benefits of long-term relationships require sustained long-term commitment. And so the solution to this problem, according to the commitment device model, is to act irrationally. So according to the model, love acts as a commitment device following mate choice, motivating foreclosure on these sort of superficially better romantic alternatives. Love also signals to a partner that your interest in the relationship won't sort of disappear following a slight dip in their desirability. So although the commitment device model is intuitively appealing, there's a number of possible problems. One possible problem with the commitment device model is that both passionate love and companionate love have been shown to decline over time. And so if love is designed for motivating this sustained long-term commitment, it's not entirely clear why it should decrease over the course of a relationship. Another possible problem with the commitment device model is that arrangements involving multiple partners, like polygamy, are common cross-culturally. And these secondary relationships don't seem to be devoid of love. So it does seem to be the case, for example, that you can love both of your spouses or both of your partners. The third and perhaps biggest problem with the commitment device model is that existing research on relationship satisfaction doesn't seem to be consistent with this concept of foreclosing on alternatives. And what do I mean by this? Well, existing research suggests that the quality of your partner relative to alternatives seems to influence how satisfied you actually are with that relationship, and in turn, how likely you are to remain in that relationship. So to put this in a sort of graphical form, when few high quality alternatives are available, satisfaction is high, but when many high quality alternatives are available, satisfaction seems to decrease. And the likelihood of staying in that relationship also seems to decrease. So on the one hand, we have the commitment device model suggesting that love motivates foreclosure on alternatives to sustain commitment. And on the other hand, we have existing research on relationship satisfaction suggesting that the quality of those alternatives actually calibrates how committed you are through its effect on relationship satisfaction. And so how can we explain this sort of apparent discrepancy in the literature? So one possible solution, in keeping with the commitment device account, is to conceptualize love as a moderator of this relationship. So if love is in fact a commitment device, one might expect that the relationship between the quality of your partner relative to alternatives and satisfaction is weaker among those in love. So those in love can sort of be blinded to the effect of those alternatives on satisfaction. So again, to put this in graphical form, when we have few high quality alternatives, satisfaction is high. And when we have many high quality alternatives, satisfaction decreases. But among those in love, the effect of these high quality alternatives on satisfaction is weaker, right? So the person is essentially blinded to the effect of these alternatives. An alternative solution is to abandon the commitment device model entirely and try a totally new model. And this alternative model we're calling the relationship maintenance model. So according to the relationship maintenance model, love isn't actually about motivating commitment, but it's about motivating investment in valuable relationships. So according to the model, in keeping with the literature, relationship satisfaction tracks the quality of your partner relative to alternatives. This assessment is then hypothesized to feed into a variety of other mechanisms, including love and jealousy. And romantic love, in turn, is predicted to motivate relationship maintenance behavior. So this part here, this mediation, is the key part of the model that we tested across 4 studies. We didn't test the link between satisfaction and jealousy or satisfaction and closeness in these studies because we were primarily focused on romantic love. And we only tested the link between love and relationship maintenance behavior in study 3. But this link has been shown previously in a variety of other, this link has been shown previously in other literature. So unlike the commitment device model, which suggests that love motivates foreclosure on alternatives, the relationship maintenance model suggests that the quality of your partner relative to alternatives actually calibrates how in love you are and also how satisfied you are. So, and love in turn motivates investment in that relationship through relationship maintenance behavior. So again, to put this in graphical form, we have when few high quality alternatives are available, according to the relationship maintenance model, love and satisfaction should be high, and relationship maintenance behavior should also be high. But as the number of high quality alternatives increases, both satisfaction and love are expected to decrease, and relationship maintenance behavior is also expected to decrease. So the relationship maintenance model is predicting that love motivates investments in those relationships to which one is already committed. So in a series of studies, we attempted to test between this commitment device moderation account and this relationship maintenance mediation account. So in studies 1 through 4, participants in heterosexual romantic relationships completed measures of partner quality, relationship satisfaction, and romantic love. To assess partner quality, participants rated how attractive, intelligent, kind, and so on their partner was. They rated their partner across a series of dimensions. And then we compared these assessments to all other partners in the sample to get an assessment of their partner's quality relative to alternatives. For love, in studies 1 through 3, we used the triangular love scale, which has 3 different subscales: intimacy, commitment, and passion. And then we used, in study 4, we used an alternative measure of love, which is called the perceived relationship quality components inventory, which is just a 3-item measure assessing how much you love, cherish, and adore your partner. In study 1, we had a small undergraduate sample. In study 2, we had a larger MTurk sample. In study 3, we had a dyadic sample. So we had couples answering, both members of the couple answering our survey. And in study 3, we also had reports of relationship maintenance behavior. And then in study 4, we had a larger dyadic sample. So again, we had couples, both members of the couple answering the survey. So, all right, so looking at the results, the commitment device model, for the commitment device model, in study 1, we didn't find a significant theory supportive interaction. So the relationship between the quality of your partner relative to alternatives and satisfaction did not appear to be moderated by romantic love. In study 2, however, we did find a significant theory supportive interaction. So the quality of your partner relative to alternatives, the relationship between the quality of your partner relative to alternatives and satisfaction was attenuated by romantic love, so that among those in love, this relationship was weaker. In study 3, however, we again failed to find this interaction. So again, this relationship was not weakened by love in study 3. And then in study 4, using an alternative measure of love, we again failed to find a significant interaction between love and the quality of your partner relative to alternatives. So overall, the commitment device model was not consistently supported. We only found support in study 2. Here are the results for the relationship maintenance model. So in study 1, we found a significant indirect effect. So the quality of your partner relative to alternatives influenced how satisfied you were in that relationship, and satisfaction in turn influenced how in love you felt. In study 2, we again found a significant indirect effect. So again, the quality of your partner relative to alternatives influenced love through its effect on satisfaction. In study 3, again, we found a significant indirect effect using a dyadic sample. And we found that love, but not satisfaction, significantly predicted relationship maintenance behavior in keeping with the relationship maintenance model's predictions. And then in study 4, using an alternative measure of love, we again found a significant indirect effect among both men and women in another dyadic sample, and using an alternative measure of love. So the results seem to be robust across multiple measures of love. So in studies 1 through 4, we found stronger support, or at least more consistent support, for the relationship maintenance model. So in study 5, we decided to test one core prediction of that model, which is that the quality of your partner relative to alternatives predicts feelings of love across 44 countries. We unfortunately did not have satisfaction in this study, so we weren't able to test the full mediation account. So here are the countries that we had in our sample, shown in pink. So the darkness of the color indicates higher mean levels of love. So you can see, for example, that in the United States, mean levels of love were higher than in Mexico. And then the dots here indicate the cities from which we sampled. So here are the 44 countries that we had in our sample. All right, so now I'm going to show you the results from study 5. So on the y-axis here, we have romantic love. And on the x-axis here, we have the quality of your partner relative to alternatives. So as you go further on the right here, this indicates that your partner is higher in quality relative to alternatives. And as you go higher here, that means that you're reporting more love. And so as you can see across cultures, the quality of your partner relative to alternatives predicted feelings of love. So we have this positive relationship here in which those whose partners are higher in quality relative to alternatives are also reporting more love. The slope of the relationship between relative partner quality and romantic love was positive in every culture that we examined. So this effect seemed to be robust cross-culturally. So to conclude, across 5 studies, we found support for a new functional model of romantic love that we're referring to as the relationship maintenance model. A core prediction of that model, which is that the quality of your partner relative to alternatives predicts feelings of love, successfully replicated across 44 countries. And overall, the commitment device model was less consistently supported. So these results shed light on the functional design of love, which is a cross-culturally ubiquitous and also very potent emotion. So thank you to my advisor, Dan Conroy Beam, and to our collaborator in our lab, Katie Walter, and also our 100+ cross-cultural collaborators who helped us collect our cross-cultural data. So thank you guys for listening.
Awesome, great job, Ben. I will be helping to ask the questions. So if anybody has any questions for Ben, feel free to write in the little Q&A box. Awesome, Ben, so we have our first question. What are some examples of relationship maintenance behavior and how do you conceptualize romantic love?
Okay, yes, great. So I actually have a slide that I took out of the presentation on relationship maintenance behavior. So this is the measure that we use. Let me just show you the slide. So we use what's called the routine and strategic maintenance behavior scale, and there's 7 factors. So one is what they're calling assurances. So like I tell my partner how much they mean to me. Openness, I encourage my partner to share their feelings. Conflict management, I apologize when I'm wrong. Shared tasks, positivity, advice, so giving advice to your partner, and then social networks, so spending time with the same friends. So this was our measure of relationship maintenance behavior that we used in our study. I had to take this out for the sake of time, which is why this was a hidden slide. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Oh, so the second part, how do you conceptualize romantic love?
Yeah, so I was primarily focused on the actual momentary. I think, more interested in the feelings of love. So we actually, these results, we replicated also using just the passion subscale of the triangular love inventory. All the results remain consistent. And that gets more at sort of the feeling of love, the actual affective feeling that you have. So I think I'm conceptualizing this a little bit more as an actual feeling rather than just saying, I love my partner in the sense of a sort of long-term assessment. I'm thinking of it more in terms of the actual emotion.
Awesome, thank you, Ben. Next question, are there individual differences in which model is best?
So do you mean, so for certain, whether one model is a better predictor among some populations, for example?
I am guessing so.
Okay. Yeah, so that's a good question. That's not something we've looked at, but it is possible that among some individuals, perhaps the commitment device model is a better model. It could be that maybe we didn't test the commitment device model in our cross-cultural sample, so it could be that because we didn't have satisfaction, but it could be that in some cultures the commitment device model is in fact a better and more robust model than the relationship maintenance model. That's a good suggestion, and that's something worth looking at in future research.
Awesome, thank you, Ben. I think we have time for just one more question. There are a few more in this chat, so for those that don't have their questions answered, feel free to reach out to Ben over email. But Shelley says, this is such a great project and so glad to see your work on romantic love. Her question is, since qualities measured relative to others in the sample that the subjects may not know? Are they realistic alternatives? Would perceptions of available alternatives be a more proximal predictor?
Yes, so we're actually collecting another wave of cross-cultural data where we do have actual measures in which people rate alternatives in their life. So the quality of their partner relative to alternatives in their life. So we do have an actual assessment that we're going to be using in a follow-up study. The reason that we wanted in this originally to not use that was there's a bit of a directionality issue, which is that if there's some research on the commitment device model suggesting that love might motivate disinterest in alternatives. And so by asking about alternatives and showing a relationship between love and perceptions of those alternatives, it's unclear if love is distorting perceptions of alternatives or if alternatives are calibrating how in love you are. So there's a bit of a directionality issue. And so by assessing alternatives in a sort of, I don't want to say objective way, but in a more indirect way, we can help to mitigate that directionality issue. But we are looking in a follow-up study, we are going to be including an actual measure where we ask participants about their alternatives as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben. So I think we're finished with questions, but maybe, Ben, if you can answer these questions in the Q&A, or people can reach out to you over email. But great job.
Thanks.
Did you guys want to let me share my video?
Yes, Jordan.
There we go. All right. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, fantastic. All right. Next up, we got Daniel Thayer. Daniel got his bachelor's in psychology from the University of Iowa. He is currently working alongside his advisor, Tommy Sprague, in researching the interplay between attention and working memory. He's especially interested in priority maps and how they guide attention. As some of you may already know, Daniel received an honorable mention from NSF for his outstanding fellowship proposal. A few fun facts about Daniel: he loves to travel, and if he was not currently in graduate school, he would be most likely a travel agent. I kid you not. Daniel has actually begged me to plan a trip for me for this like past month or so. He's even dressed up like a travel agent right now. So the next time you're going to a conference, contact Daniel and he can take care of your travel plans. Lastly, Daniel is an avid gamer and foodie. He has a passion for cooking and his meals smell amazing, and claims that he can make a better homemade pizza than Barry Giesbrecht. Ooh, shots fired. All right, now let's hear from the priority map man himself. Daniel, take it away.
Oh, thank you so much, Jordan. Let's see. Can you all see my screen okay and hear me? Sweet. So whenever we're looking at a particular visual scene, there are various different items or locations in which we could direct our attention towards. Let's say, for example, you're looking at a scene from the perspective of Tommy's baby, Evan. And within the scene, there are salient items that may capture Evan's attention, like this colorful painting in the background and these bright and colorful MATLAB figures on the screen. Additionally, Evan may have recently just discovered he has these really cool things called toes, and he's been making it his goal to always direct his attention and play with those toes, with his toes whenever he gets the chance. So, as is evident here, there are different items in any given scene that we can direct our attention to, and how attention is ultimately allocated within the visual field is computed in what is known as a priority map. So a priority map is this cognitive representation of the relative importance of different parts of the scene and is generally considered to be feature agnostic. This feature agnostic priority map is computed based on maps of individual feature dimensions, such as color map, orientation map, or motion map. And these feature dimension maps are then comprised of individual maps of feature values that are extracted from the visual scene. So for example, in like a color dimension map, that might be comprised of individual maps of green, blue, yellow, etc. Importantly, information within and across these various maps can be modulated by things like the goals of the observer, like when Evan was looking for his toes in the example, in addition to the salience of stimuli in the visual field, such as the bright, colorful MATLAB figures I was talking about. However, how these modulations occur across visual regions and are ultimately integrated into this unified neural priority map remains unknown. So to start getting at this big picture question of an integrated neural priority map, in the current study, we focused on a specific aspect, the featured dimension map part of this theory. And so for a neural region to correspond to this idea of a featured dimension map, it needs to meet a couple of different criteria. One, needs to contain feature selective salience information corresponding to individual locations. And previous work has also additionally shown that particular feature values can be globally prioritized by the goals of the observers. So these sort of top-down modulations need to be present as well. Also, since these are feature-specific maps containing presumably spatial information, a corresponding neural region needs to have some sort of feature specificity and needs to have some sort of spatial organization. Luckily, previous fMRI work has identified feature-selective retinotopic cortical regions, such as HMT+, which is a retinotopic motion selective region, and HV4, VO1, and VO2, which are retinotopic color selective regions, making these areas prime candidates for potential feature dimension maps. So with that information in mind, we asked a couple of questions in this study. First, we want to know how, if HV4 for color and HMT+ for motion act as these feature dimension maps within the priority map framework. So we also want to know how these regions are modulated by the goals of the observer. We also want to know how these regions are modulated by the salience of stimuli in the visual field. In the first experiment, we attempted to answer these first two questions by having participants perform a feature selective attention task. So in this task, participants are shown a colored moving dot stimulus on every trial. At the beginning of each trial, they're cued to attend to either the motion or the color present within the stimulus. Once they're cued to a particular feature dimension, they had to determine which individual feature value was most prevalent. So for example, if they're cued to attend to the motion of the stimulus, they had to determine if there's more clockwise or counterclockwise motion present. So importantly, I want to highlight with this design that salience is kept constant throughout the whole experiment. Both clockwise and counterclockwise motion and red and blue dots are always present. Importantly, we're manipulating the goals of the observer on each trial, whether attending to one feature or the other. We collected this data while participants were in the scanner. And in an independent session, we had participants do a retinotopy task. This was done to allow us to identify the feature selective regions of interest based on well-characterized visual polar angle and eccentricity values of individual voxels. In these identified regions of interest, we computed an inverted encoding model. So to briefly give an overview of this model, we first compute spatial channel weights for each voxel using an independent mapping task. We then invert those weights, run them with data from our feature selective attention task, which allows us to estimate new spatial channel weights, importantly in visual field coordinates on every trial. We then align these channel weights based on the known position of the stimulus, average across trials, which generates image reconstructions that look something like this. And we can compare the strength of the stimulus representation between conditions in these reconstructed images. So really, the important takeaway, the reason why we're using this method here is that it allows us to reconstruct these images that are in visual field coordinates. So that's why we're doing this. So using these methods, we predict that if these color and motion selective regions act as feature dimension maps within that priority map framework, then in our color selective regions, we should see a stronger stimulus representation when participants are attending to color as compared to when they're attending to motion. We should see that inverse result in the motion selective regions, where there's a stronger stimulus representation when participants are attending to motion. Importantly, these stimulus representations should be localized generally to the known location of the aligned stimulus. So these are our image reconstructions from color selective regions when participants are attending to color and when they're attending to motion. And at least qualitatively here, it does appear that there's a stronger representation when participants are attending to color as compared to motion. And we see that inverse result here in our motion selective regions, where there does appear to be a stronger stimulus representation when participants are attending to motion. Importantly, across these reconstructions, the stimulus representation does appear to be localized to the aligned stimulus position. Then we wanted to quantify these results, and we did this by computing an attention modulation index within our motion and color regions independently. where inputs to this index are just the mean activation within the known dimensions of the presented stimulus for each condition, and where positive values indicate a stronger representation when participants were attending to motion. And as evident from these results, the stimulus representations were in fact strongest when attending to the preferred feature of each region. So going back to our questions, in this first experiment, we were in fact able to reconstruct these spatial maps from feature selective cortical areas. And we demonstrated that the stimulus representations in these reconstructed maps were strongest when participants were attending to the preferred feature of a given region. In experiment 2, we wanted to see how the stimulus, the salience of stimuli presented in the visual field influences these stimulus representations to further bolster the claim that these regions act as feature dimension maps. So to test this, we had participants perform a task where they're attending to a central fixation cross throughout the whole experiment and monitoring whether either the horizontal line or the vertical line increased in size at any given moment. And they were supported that with a button press. While participants were attending to the central fixation cross, there was a dot array in the background, either a colored static dot array or a black and white moving dot array. Importantly, there was a portion of the array that was made salient. So for the colored static dot array, the salient stimulus was a different color from the rest of the array. And in the black and white moving dot array, the salient stimulus was moving in the opposite direction from the rest of the array. These color values updated every 500 milliseconds. And the important thing I want to highlight with this design is that the goals of the observer is always kept constant at the central fixation. And the thing we're manipulating here is the salience of the stimulus. The methods we used for this experiment were the same as I described in experiment 1. And so we predict that if these color and motion regions act as these feature dimension maps, then again, in these color regions, the stimulus representation should be strongest when salience is defined by color as compared to when it's defined by motion. And we should see this inverse result in the motion regions where there's a stronger stimulus representation when salience is defined by motion. Again, importantly, these representations should be localized to the location of the presented stimulus. These are our image reconstructions from the color selective regions when salience was defined by color and when salience was defined by motion. And here we again see that the representation was strongest when salience was defined by color. We see that inverse result in our motion selective regions where the stimulus representation was strongest, at least qualitatively, when salience was defined by motion. Again, wanted to quantify our results using an index, this time a salience modulation index, where we again took the mean activation within the known dimensions of the presented stimuli. And positive values here indicate that there's a stronger representation when salience was defined by motion. Similar to experiment 1, we see that these stimulus representations were in fact strongest when salience was based on the preferred feature of each region, further supporting the notion that these regions act as feature dimension maps. So to sum up, in both experiments, we were in fact able to reconstruct these spatial maps from color and motion selective regions, and we demonstrated they're modulated by both top-down goals and bottom-up salience. Well, more specifically, in experiment 1, we showed that task goals selectively enhanced the stimulus representation at the location of the stimulus in regions that prefer the attended feature, which is consistent with previous univariate results. In experiment 2, we showed that these stimulus representations were localized to the location of the salient stimulus, and that they were strongest when salience was defined by the preferred feature of a given region. Overall, these results suggest that HV4 for color and HMT plus for motion act as these neural feature dimension maps within the priority map framework. Thank you for your attention.
Awesome job. Great job, Daniel. That was awesome. Again, like we did for Ben, if anybody has questions. All right, we have our first question, Daniel. So Barry says, great talk. There's a strong spatial component here, both in terms of the task and in terms of the modeling approach. So are these pure feature selective maps, or are they spatially mediated feature dimension maps? And what are your thoughts on whether there are feature dimension maps coded independently of spatial position?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Barry. So yeah, definitely it's evident here based on the encoding that we're doing here that things are very heavily based on spatial information, which is important for this construction of a map. And I do think, at least for me, it's kind of hard to conceptualize information on color that is completely, or like any sort of feature that is completely devoid of some sort of location component to it. So I guess my initial intuition it'd be maybe hard pressed to find sort of these feature independent representations in the brain that doesn't have some sort of spatial component, but I mean, that could very well be something that occurs. I very much so think that a lot of these feature dynamics are tied to spatial information generally. I guess one interesting thing that I think that we're thinking about doing as a follow-up to something like this is look at feature-based attention more generally. So also see how that relates to these maps, right? Feature-based attention, when you're attending to something like the color red, see how that spreads throughout, whether it's just at like one location or is it every instance of red within the visual field. So that is another angle that we're thinking of going kind of related to this question. Oh, he's also asking about whether thick or thin crust. Definitely thick, deep dish, all the way.
Does anybody have any other questions for Daniel? We have another question from Evan. Do you ever have people proactively not attend to stimulus?
So we had 3 pretty well-trained graduate students so far. This is mostly pilot data right now. So generally, they're doing a good job of attending to the stimulus across. We monitor behavioral performance as well. And like are trying to maintain roughly 80% accuracy throughout the entire experiment for both of the tasks. So we can interject between whether or not we're seeing people not attending to things, getting things incorrect, and try to make sure that they are actively attending to the stimuli.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. If nobody has any other questions, I think just give you a round of applause. Great job, Daniel. You know what? Sorry, I think we actually have one more quick question from Carly. So have you thought about having the different types of features, motion or color compete with each other for salience? I'm curious what would happen if the goal was up to them.
Yeah. This would, I guess, suppose be related to the first experiment. Yeah, I don't know if I've necessarily thought about that specific manipulation in regards to sort of the top-down like active manipulation like languages choose which feature to attend to in that context. One thing we have been thinking about in relation to experiment 2 is sort of changing how salience might be defined within the display, right? So we just have the counter. We either have it like specifically be some sort of motion salience or color salience. We're definitely thinking about playing with exactly the type of features and the interaction between like motion and color within these stimuli to see what sort of different activation patterns we see within our reconstructed maps. So yeah, we're having a lot of different ideas on how exactly to incorporate feature combinations within our designs.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. I think we're out of time for questions, but if anybody has any other questions, they can reach out to you directly. So great job.
Vicky, you're muted.
Yeah, got it. Thank you. So I will be introducing our next speaker, and that is going to be Elisa Bedrov. So Elisa received a double major in psychology and Russian from Duke University in 2019. Elisa came directly from Duke to UCSB, where she now works with Shelley Gable to understand how people keep and share secrets. So in addition to being an excellent sock chewer in her day, Elisa must have also been an excellent competitor in Two Truths and a Lie because she has 3 kidneys. This is a little bit of a digression, but I'll let you all in on a little secret about me. I have a super weird jealousy about people who have fun answers for icebreakers. And I can't remember who, but someone in this apartment still has their baby teeth. And I remember like I had a distinct memory of like a visceral feeling of jealousy when I learned that about that person. Can't remember who it is, but I remember that I was jealous. But now Elisa kind of takes the cake for that jealousy. So secrets out, I am jealous. I'm very jealous of Elisa's kidneys for pure icebreaker purposes. Okay, Lisa, it's time to start spilling the secrets on secrets. And yeah, sorry, that was another really bad joke. So take it away, Lisa.
Thank you, Vicki. Go ahead and share my screen. All right, I'll make the assumption that everyone can see. So hi everyone, today I'm going to be talking about the effects of secret sharing on interpersonal evaluations. So despite the idea that secrets are something that, personally we usually don't want to be shared, we still tend to share both our own and other people's secrets quite commonly. And for the most part, the literature on secrecy has focused on the benefits at the individual level. So even though we usually kind of worry about the negative consequences of if we reveal personal information about ourselves, disclosing personal secrets has been associated with improved well-being and health, increased self-esteem, and decreased rumination and mind wandering. And so a lot of that is due to kind of that relief of the secrecy burden. And so for the most part, this research has looked at what I will be calling personal secrets. So this is when the information is relevant to the person who's sharing it. So if I were to say, my partner just broke up with me, or I was laid off at work last week, that's information that, is fully mine to share. But another common type of secret is what I will be calling secondhand secrets. And so this is when the information is about someone else. So if your friend comes to you and says, hey, I was just broken up with last week, or I just lost my job, please don't tell anyone. If you were to share that secret with someone else, that would be sharing a secondhand secret. And so regardless of whether it's a personal secret, secondhand secret, secrets are a social phenomenon because they're always being kept from or shared with another person. And so naturally they have a lot of social implications for our relationships, which is the aspect of secrets that I'm interested in. So kind of expanding it beyond just the individual level. And specifically, I'm interested in how we evaluate secret sharers on trustworthiness, closeness, and social utility, with the idea being that these three evaluations may differ depending on the type of secret that's being shared. So to start with trustworthiness, when we share personal secrets, that tends to kind of promote this idea of trustworthiness because, so if you imagine that you're the recipient of the secret and someone comes to you, you see that they're being vulnerable with you and you kind of feel the sense of trust towards them. Whereas if someone comes and shares a secondhand secret with you, that actually might have the opposite effect of being a red flag of like, hey, this person is breaking their promise by sharing someone else's secret with me. So that could be potentially problematic. Maybe I don't want to share my secrets with them. For closeness, however, the effects might be more similar between personal and secondhand secrets. So in both cases, by sharing a secret, someone is coming to you and saying, hey, I like you, I trust you, maybe even more than the person whose secret I'm sharing with you, because I'm opening up to you, revealing this information. And so that could, in both cases, promote a sense of kind of intimacy and likability. And then the last outcome that I'm interested in is social utility, which has been kind of overlooked in the secrecy literature. And this is the idea that you're useful as a social connection. And this is especially relevant for secondhand secrets because those are about other people in our social network. So the idea is that, if someone tells you a secret about someone in your friend group, you might not necessarily trust them, but you still want to affiliate them because you think that you can benefit from being associated with them and kind of get like the inside scoop as to what's going on. So these are the three outcomes that I was interested in. And I'm also interested in two potential moderators of the effects. The first one being relationship type, so how close the secret sharer is to the recipient. So previous work on personal secrets has shown that like intimate self-disclosure to strangers is actually perceived as inappropriate. So that could conversely lead to less closeness as opposed to more. And then for secondhand secrets, it's generally more acceptable to share information from a low-level intimate to a high-level intimate than vice versa. So for example, if a classmate tells you a secret, it's more acceptable for you to share that secret with your best friend than for you to share your best friend's secret with that classmate. And then the other moderator I'm interested in is sharing breadth. So we tend to prefer to be the unique recipients of information. So most likely for both personal and secondhand secrets, if they're shared with just you, you have that kind of like special feeling and that will promote closeness. And then understandably, if secondhand secrets are shared more broadly with more people, that tends to suggest less trustworthiness. So we conducted 2 online studies looking at these questions. In study 1, we looked at how the effects of secret sharing depend on secret type and the relationship with the recipient. We conducted this both on MTurk and using the SONA subject pool and had 1,385 participants. And so we varied whether the secret was a personal or secondhand secret, and the person disclosing it in the vignette was either an acquaintance or a close friend. And participants were imagining themselves as the recipient of the secret. So an example, they would read, Megan is one of your closest friends and you spend a lot of time talking one-on-one. Taylor is also someone in your friend group. One day, Megan says, I don't think I'm supposed to say anything, but Taylor was recently laid off at work because the company is downsizing. So this is an example of a secondhand secret being shared by a close friend. And after reading the vignettes, participants responded to 15 scale items evaluating the secret share. So for trustworthiness, it was items like, Megan has proven to be trustworthy. For closeness, Megan sees me as a close friend. And for social utility, Megan is well integrated in our friend group. So for our results, first we found an expected main effect of secret type such that the secret sharer was evaluated as more trustworthy when they were sharing personal secrets compared to secondhand secrets. And there was also a main effect of relationship type such that close friends were generally rated higher on trustworthiness than acquaintances. For closeness, we had very similar results, such that after sharing a personal secret, the secret sharer was rated as more likable and having a closer relationship with the participant than when they shared a secondhand secret. And again, close friends were generally rated higher on closeness than acquaintances. And then lastly, for social utility, the secret sharer was rated as having higher social utility when they shared a secondhand secret relative to a personal secret. And again, close friends were rated higher on social utility than acquaintances. So as a summary of study 1, people were rated as less trustworthy after sharing a secondhand secret and as more close and likable after sharing a personal secret. They were also rated as having greater social utility after sharing a secondhand secret, but there were no moderating effects of relationship type. So the next question that we wanted to ask was whether it mattered how broadly a secret is shared, because oftentimes we don't just share secrets with one person, we might share them with multiple. And so our evaluations of the secret share might shift if we know that the secret was shared with more than just us. So study 2 was again an online study that we conducted on MTurk with 693 participants. And we looked at how the effects of secret sharing depended again on secret type, but now also varying sharing breadth. So whether it was exclusively shared with one person or non-exclusively shared with multiple people. And then one of the key differences here from study 1 was that whereas in study 1, participants were imagining that they were the recipients of the secret, in study 2, they were reading the scenario from like an outsider observer perspective. So for example, Bree, Taylor, and Kiana are 3 friends who work together at the same company and are very close. One night, Bree calls Kiana and says that her partner unexpectedly broke up with her. She wasn't quite sure how to process this and felt very upset. She mentioned that she also told Taylor about this and that she would like them to not say anything for the time being. So this is an example of a personal secret being shared non-exclusively with 2 people. And then participants just responded to 3 scale items for outcomes of interest. So for trustworthiness, they evaluated if the secret share, to what extent can the secret share be trusted to keep future information to themselves if the target was to share that information with them. For closeness, just to rate how close each of the friends were to each other after this vignette. And for social utility, to what extent is the secret share a valuable social connection to have? And so for results, similar to study 1, we saw a main effect of secret type for trustworthiness, such that the secret share was rated higher on trustworthiness after sharing a personal secret compared to a secondhand secret. And there was also a significant interaction between secret type and sharing breadth, such that for secondhand secrets, the more broadly they were shared, the less trustworthy the secret share was perceived to be. For closeness, we did not find a main effect of secret type, but there was a main effect of exclusivity, such that when the secret was shared with just one person, the secret share and the recipient were rated as having a closer relationship than when the secret was shared more broadly. And there was a marginal interaction such that for personal secrets, especially, sharing the secret with just one person was more conducive to higher ratings of closeness. And lastly, for social utility, there were no main effects, but there was a significant interaction between sharing breadth and secret type, such that for personal secrets, actually, the more broadly the secret was shared, the more valuable the secret share was rated in terms of being a valuable social connection. So to summarize, people were perceived as less trustworthy after sharing a secondhand secret, especially if shared broadly with multiple people. The highest closeness and likability ratings came from sharing a personal secret exclusively with one person. We had mixed results for social utility. So in study 1, it was higher for secondhand secrets, whereas in study 2, it was higher for personal secrets shared broadly. And there were no moderating effects of relationship type, but a significant interaction between secret type and sharing breadth. So in conclusion, we do use secret sharing to evaluate others on trustworthiness, closeness, and social utility by considering the type of secret, whether it's a personal or secondhand secret, and how broadly one shares it. Some limitations of the study were the reliance on short vignettes without kind of a lot of context or behavioral cues. Also the different measures of social utility, which could account for the discrepant results. So in study 1, we explicitly said, this social utility is being knowledgeable about other people in the friend group, whereas in study 2, we just more broadly said value as a social connection. So perhaps participants were perceiving the person as more open, and that being kind of a valuable trait to have. And then we also varied secret content. So in study 2, for example, the personal secrets were all about relationships, whereas in the secondhand secrets were all work related. For future directions, it would be great to use experience sampling or daily diaries to capture secret sharing in everyday life. Also to account for the relative closeness or power status among everyone involved. So who is sharing whose secret, and then more research on social utility and its influence on affiliative tendencies. So how do people balance the trade-offs between someone maybe not being necessarily trustworthy, but still wanting kind of the benefits of that social connection. And so with that, I'd like to thank everyone for who has given feedback on this project, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
Awesome, great job, Elisa. That was wonderful. We have our very first question from Evan. And he asks, is there a difference between people who don't share secrets versus those who do as far as perceived social value goes?
I would say yes, but it also depends on how you're thinking about social value, because I think on one hand, like you definitely would value someone who, doesn't share secrets because they kind of have that, maintain confidentiality. So from your perspective, that's a valuable person in that you likely won't be at risk from your secrets being shared. And so that kind of helps preserve your standing in the social group. But if you want to gain information about other people and kind of be more in the know as to what's going on, then that's where if someone is like, not really sharing secrets, might be a little bit less valuable in that sense. So I think it depends on kind of what aspect of social value you're looking at.
Awesome. That makes a lot of sense. The next question comes from Spencer, and he says, in study 1, trustworthiness ratings are all around the midpoint of the scale. In study 2, trustworthiness ratings are a bit higher in the personal condition. And he's just wondering what you make of that difference between the studies and why trustworthiness ratings are overall low in study 1.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think part of it I'll start with, I'm not completely sure. I haven't thought about it too much, but it could potentially be based on the perspective that because in study 1, it was that participants were imagining that they were the people receiving the secret, whereas in study 2, they were outside observers. And so there have been kind of other studies looking at how we evaluate stuff that happens to us versus to other people, and that there is kind of a difference in how we weigh those actions and kind of like the morality of them. And so I think that could potentially be part of it, in that it does matter whether they're sharing the secret with us, and that's problematic, versus with other people. And also just kind of like the limited context cues.
Awesome. Thank you, Elisa. Your next question comes from Diane, and she says, great talk and especially cool slides. Do you think some of the differences, especially for social utility, might be explained by status? So the status of the secret sharer and the status of the person that you have the good on? I'm guessing this.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's something that there definitely needs to be kind of more research on, is manipulating that of whose secret you're sharing, because Absolutely, I think if you're sharing information about someone who is of like high status in the group, that tends to augment your social utility. At the same time, though, that also presents kind of an added risk of maybe if there is someone who has high status or high power, if they find out that you shared their secret, they could have kind of a greater ability to deliver some sort of like repercussions from that. But yes, I think absolutely it does matter whose secret you know.
Awesome. And we just have one last question from Carly. Have you investigated how believability changes from personal to secondhand secrets, as well as from exclusive to non-exclusive shared secrets?
Can you kind of elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by believability?
Sure, I can. Carly, if you want to put it in the chat or.
So I hadn't thought about kind of the believability aspect. I think just because we were trying to create situations that probably would be kind of common of like the breakup or like job things. And so I think for the most part, and that's actually something of differentiating between secrets and gossip, where like gossip tends to be more subject to inaccuracy and not really knowing for sure whether that information is accurate. Versus the way that I've been defining secrets is more of that like this information is truthful and it's just whether you choose to pass it on or not. But we didn't test in the study of like whether they believed the secrets just because we kind of assumed that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elisa. Great job.
Sorry,
I think you just
everyone.
let you.
Yeah, I really like Lisa's baby photo, so I'm trying to show that to all of you. Okay. Wow, there it is again. Why? Jordan, do you want to maybe do this? Sorry, I don't know what's happening.
Sure.
Thanks.
I can share my screen, and then if you wanted to announce it.
Sure. Sounds great. Okay, so the next thing we are going to do is the Rich Mayer Award, and Heejung Kim will be announcing that award.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Hi, everyone. It is my pleasure to announce and present the Rich Mayer Award this year. Rich Mayer Award, for those people who are new to this, is an award that was established in 2013 with the generous contribution of our own Rich Mayer, and the award is given to the best, what faculty evaluate as the best second-year paper of the year. And this year, the decision was particularly difficult because we had so many strong second-year papers, but we still had to pick a winner. And the winner this year is Daniel there. Are you? Hi, I see the picture. So we all heard his excellent presentation, and please join me to congratulate Daniel. Is that it?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
All right, everyone. We're going to take a coffee break now. So please be back at 10:30 a.m. for our next presentation. If you're not a coffee drinker like myself, tea is acceptable. Orange juice also works since it's still sort of like a brunch kind of morning. And yeah, if you don't have coffee, highly recommend swinging by 4704 Fraser Lane. The Rich Mayor awardee actually got a cappuccino machine, very nice one, kind of looks like a old school Cadillac, and he'd be happy to dish out some cappuccinos for people. So yeah, we will see everybody at 10:30.
From Walter et al. So here we're looking at overall effect sizes. And in general, women seem to prefer older male mates with good financial prospects, and men had higher preferences for a younger mate who is more physically attractive. There are some small but significant differences where women wanted slightly kinder, more intelligent, and healthier mates, though both genders in general wanted a significant amount of intelligence, health, and kindness from their potential partners. So what drives, the big question here for me is what drives these sex differences in mate preferences? Is the predictor the participant's gender or the gender of the target? And by that I mean, think about in most heterosexual mate literature, you're always looking at either a female participant looking at a potential male mate or a male participant looking at a potential female mate. These become inextricably linked. So you're always either looking at a man or a woman and a woman or a man. However, what happens when it's a female participant looking for another female mate is what's going to predict these sex differences in their mate preferences going to be because of their own gender or because of the gender of the person they're looking at. So there has been some previous work on LGBT mate preferences. It does exist, but it isn't consistent. So these studies often suffer from small sample sizes, especially when compared to heterosexual sample sizes in the same papers. They oftentimes will also have inconsistent measures and procedures, and they usually rely on typical sexuality labels like gay, straight, lesbian, etc. when asking about romantic long-term preferences, even though somebody who's bisexual may only be sexually attracted to 2 or more genders. So Project Rainbow, a collaborative effort I'm leading between the CDL and the Computational Mate Choice Lab, seeks to investigate LGBT mate preferences in a very large-scale systematic way. So our big research question here was, do people have different romantic long-term mate preferences based on the gender of the person they're looking at? So there could be a lot of reasons why this may be happening, but the big hypotheses we were looking at were that the gender of the participant, the gender of the person looking, will drive the differences in what they're looking for in a partner. And our second hypothesis was that the gender of the target, so the participant's gender wouldn't matter in this case, and it was actually the person that they're looking at that would matter. So how to investigate this? How do we actually answer this question? The biromantic community provides a perfect sample for this. By definition, they are romantically attracted to 2 or more genders, so they're perfectly matched samples when looking at preferences for targets of different genders. This provides an opportunity for repeated measures, with each participant acting as their own control. So the study design was a 3x2 with participant gender being female, male, or non-binary, by 2 with the target gender being female or male. And it was a factorial design with within subjects repeated measures. So data collection was conducted in March of 2021. This was part of a pilot survey of Project Rainbow, a larger study on mate preferences for LGBT people. We collected 450 participant responses from there. And of those 450 people, 147 participants reported romantic attraction to 2 or more genders, and they were included in this current study sample. So they were English speakers ranging from 18 to 51 years old. There were 66 females, 44 males, and 30 non-binary people in our sample. So how did we measure this? So we essentially made two measures that were identical except for one key thing. So these measures were on the participants' valuations of 6 mate preference traits: health, intelligence, kindness, physical attractiveness, financial prospects, and age. As we saw with the Walter et al. Paper, there's a lot of previous work on the magnitude of possible sex differences, and these are reliably tested cross-culturally. These are not the most important mate preference traits, but these have substantial work within that's been done in the heterosexual mate literature that we can compare to. So the participants were asked to consider an ideal romantic long-term partner and what amount of each trait they would possess from numbers 1 to 11, 1 being extremely low level of a trait, to 11 being extremely high level of a trait. So these two measures are the same, except for in one case, they were asking participants to think about a male target, and the other was asking them to think about a female target. This survey was posted on Qualtrics and administered to participants. So here are my results, but let me explain a little bit of how I'm going to be presenting this. So we ran a 3x2 ANOVA on each of the 6 traits we mentioned before. And so I'm going to be presenting first 3 traits that tend to have little or very small sex differences. So health, intelligence, and kindness. On the x-axis, we're going to have the gender of the participant, so female, non-binary, or male. And then on the y-axis, we're going to have the ideal level of the trait from 1 to 11. And so these are going to be violin plots. And so the plots in red are for when people are looking at female targets, and when they're in blue, they're looking at male targets. So our first trait was health, and there were no significant differences here based on participant gender or target gender. Same thing goes for intelligence. Again, there were no significant differences. And then when we get to kindness, we actually did find a difference. So in general here, participant gender didn't matter. So no matter the gender of the person who was looking for a partner, in general, they tended to be when looking at female mates, they tended to put a higher value on kindness versus male mates. And this was across female, non-binary, male participants. So same setup here. So physical attractiveness actually had a huge effect size here. This was specifically for participant gender, again, didn't seem to matter here. It was specifically when looking at female targets, participants wanted them to be more physically attractive versus when they were looking at male targets. So with financial prospects, we actually didn't find any significant differences. But for age, we again did find a difference here. So here again, regardless of the gender of the participant, when looking at female mates, they tended to prefer a younger mate versus when they were looking at male mates. And so here, the numbers 1 through 11 were representing age groups. So here they tended to prefer people from under 20 to around 20s to around the mid 30s. So what does all this mean? So our preliminary results here support our second hypothesis. No matter the gender of the person who is looking for a mate, it seems that didn't seem to have an effect here. It seemed to be that the gender of the target was driving these sex differences. So I just want to finish up by thanking my lab, my advisor, Dr. German, and my science brothers, Jack and Spencer.
Okay, thanks, Selena, for the great talk. So everyone, if you have any question, you can type that in the Q&A box for Selena. Oh, it looks like someone typed a question in the chat box. I may have missed this, but what was the average age of the sample?
So it was between 18 to 51. I believe people were around their mid-20s to mid-30s.
Also, just a reminder to everyone that please type your question in the Q&A box so that we don't miss the question. Do you have any other questions, guys? Oh, there we go. Okay, so Diane asked, were the results independent of the participant's age?
I believe so. I don't think the participant's age seemed to matter here. But again, I should note that these are very preliminary results. We're going to be running this again with the main survey of Project Rainbow with a few thousand people, hopefully. And this was based on 147 people. So I'm not totally sure, but preliminary analyses seem to say that that doesn't seem to matter.
Okay, so we have another question from Anissa. This seems like an interesting study. Where do you see your next study research question going with this line of research?
So one of the things that we were debating as a group was how exactly do we group participants based on their bisexuality, right? Because we can split them up either by their romantic orientation, sexual orientation, or what their reported attractions to other people are. So reconfiguring this and looking at perhaps how people who are only sexually attracted to two or more genders or both sexually and romantically attracted to two or more genders changes their mate preferences. And then also comparing short-term preferences to long-term preferences and seeing if that is affected as well.
Last question from Evan. Does it matter whether an individual is looking for someone to casually date versus looking for a long-term partner?
So here we were specifically looking at long-term partners. So we haven't looked specifically at short-term, aka like casual dating. And there were also a couple issues here where some queer people aren't necessarily looking for short-term relationships or long-term relationships based on like individual criteria. Like, so somebody who's asexual but is attracted to two or more genders may not be looking for a short-term relationship. So there are a few issues with that as well. So going forward, we will be looking at short-term preferences, but also checking in and seeing how we can make this more representative of the community.
Great. Thanks again for Selena. I'm going to hand it over to the MC for the next presenter.
All righty, that was a great presentation. Our next presenter is Kevin Honeywell. Kevin received his bachelor's in psychology from Auburn University, along with a master's in psychology from the University of Memphis, go Grizzlies. Currently, he is working with his advisor, Todd Kippen, on investigating the neural underpinnings of methamphetamine addiction and developing novel treatments to combat its deleterious effects. In addition to being a skilled researcher, Kevin is also a competitive Guild Wars player, which is honestly pretty impressive. For those who might not know, Guild Wars is a very popular video game that takes tremendous planning, coordination with other players, and dedication. Kevin, I actually have a question for you. Do you have a Twitch stream or any plans to have a Twitch stream?
I do not actually, especially that game is fairly unpopular nowadays. So it's
It's like the second most popular MMORPG, you know? Well, Kevin also plays pool, bass guitar, and hopes to one day publish a novel. So I'm pretty sure people are tired of hearing me talk already. So Kevin, go ahead and take it away.
alrighty. Okay, there we go. Yeah, as Jordan was mentioning, my talk's going to be on about attenuating methamphetamine addiction, and that's specifically with a phosphoester 4B inhibitor. So methamphetamine is a prevalent health issue. It's pretty well abused, especially here in the United States. And so it's important to be able to find some sort of remedy or treatment for this systemic issue. Additionally, methamphetamine also causes neuroinflammation. So what is neuroinflammation? Neuroinflammation is the brain's defense against injury and infection, and it includes a few different types of cells, including microglia, which are central nervous system macrophages that are able to engulf aberrant materials, as well as neutrophils, which are phagocytes that respond to signs of inflammation, and this is more circulatory based. And as well as there's also cytokines, which are small proteins that play a role in the immune system and inflammation. And these are usually released in response to some sort of infection or something, and they're actually are able to attract these microglia and neutrophils to the location of this attack and be able to help remedy this effect. And so here we can see on the bottom of the screen that there's, neurotoxins such as methamphetamine can get into the brain, and they actually activate these microglia, and these microglia then can respond to the neurons that are being affected. So methamphetamine and neuroinflammation. Methamphetamine actually increases the permeability of the blood-brain barrier, which allows some of these specific neuroinflammation cells to be able to get into the brain. And here we can see on the side panel that this is showing this, where we're looking at occludin, which is a specific protein that marks these epithelial cells within the blood-brain barrier. And we can actually see that the untreated rats have very close together epithelial cells, whereas the methamphetamine-induced ones have them a little further apart. So we're seeing this loosening of the blood-brain barrier there. Additionally, methamphetamine increases the pro-inflammatory response in the brain. So we're seeing this inflammation in the brain due to methamphetamine. And so the idea is, what can we do to combat this? Additionally, though, we also find that there's actual substrain differences in this immune response as well. So there's this mouse strain called the B6NJ mouse, which is a substrain of the more stereotypical B6J mouse used in research. And it was developed because they were separated into different colonies at some point. And this actually caused them to have some different changes in their neuroinflammation responses. And so B6NJ mice have an actual shorter but more robust immune response than their B6J counterparts. Additionally, we find that these substrain differences, and this may be related to neuroinflammation, actually have differences in their drug taking. And for example, in a previous study done by Karen, B6NJ mice consumed less alcohol than their B6J mice. And so the idea here is that you can see here in the bottom that there's different quantities of ethanol that they're able to drink. And we can see here on our right panel that our B6NJ mice are actually consuming less of these different quantities of ethanol than their B6J counterparts. So additionally, one of the main topics here is that we have this enzyme called phosphoesterase 4B, and it's going to regulate inflammation. And what does phosphoesterase 4B do? It hydrolyzes CAMP, and A33 is actually a drug that is what we're going to be looking at. And so here on the right, we can see that PDE4B comes in, it hydrolyzes CAMP, and leads to this pro-inflammatory response. So perhaps by inhibiting it and allowing more CAMP accumulation, we'll actually see this anti-inflammatory response, which may be related to this decrease in drug taking. So here we see, so PDE4B inhibition, which was A33, which is the drug we'll be talking about later as well, actually is showed to attenuate alcohol consumption. And this occurs for both our B6NJ mice and the B6J mice. So both of these animal substrains are taking less of the ethanol due to this A33 drug. So in our current study, we look to extend this research into the field of methamphetamine addiction. And so this current study attempts to link differences in neuroinflammation to difference in methamphetamine oral self-administration. And so here on the bottom, we can kind of see what it looks like for our animals. And what we do is we put them in this box, and they have, on the left side, they have an inactive whole nose poke, and on the right side, they have an active whole nose poke. And so they're able to just put their nose in there, and if they're able to do that, they actually get a reward, which is methamphetamine in a water solution, which they're able to drink. And so that's what we did. We allowed them to do this over 30 days, in which they were able to learn how to take this drug, and they became pretty stable responders for this drug, for methamphetamine. And then following this study also looks to attempt to extend this therapeutic effect of PD4B inhibition using this drug A33, which is a PD4B inhibitor, to actually attenuate our methamphetamine addiction. So what we did there is before putting them into the box, we injected them subcutaneously with this drug, or intraperitoneally, sorry, with this drug, and then we let them wait, and then we put them into the box and allowed them to once again try and take the drug, and we looked to see whether or not there might be differences due to this drug being on board. So first we looked at the days to criterion. How long did it take our mice to actually obtain the self-administration paradigm? And here we can see that our B6J mice actually reached our criterion much quicker than our B6NJ mice. They learned to take the amount of meth we wanted them to take quicker than the B6NJ mice. And then we looked at the first 5 days of acquisition, which is the first 5 days that we allowed them to self-administer this methamphetamine. And this is important to look at just innate differences between our different strains and also our sexes. And so here we can see that our B6J mice took significantly more meth per body weight than our B6NJ mice. And we also see that males actually take significantly less meth than their female counterparts. So then we looked at the last 3 days of acquisition, which really shows how their behaviors are changing as they've actually acquired the self-administration paradigm. And here we can see that these effects persist, where our B6J mice continue to take more meth than our B6NJ mice, and our male mice continue to take less meth than our female mice. Yes, less than our female mice. So then finally, we moved on to actually giving them our drug of interest, the A33, which is, as I mentioned, is a PDE4B inhibitor. And here in our first panel, we can see that giving any of our doses of this PDE4B inhibitor actually decreased the amount of meth our animals were taking. But however, we continue to see, as in the panel in the middle, that our B6J mice, even though they're attenuating their meth taking, they still continue to take more meth than their B6NJ counterparts. And as well as we continue to see the same trend in our male mice, where they continue to take less meth than the female counterparts. So overall, A33 is a promising therapeutic for methamphetamine addiction. So first, our B6J mice consume significantly more methamphetamine than our B6NJ mice, which persisted even when they were taking A33. Our female mice consume significantly more methamphetamine than our male mice, which persisted even during A33 attenuated meth taking. And these differences in neuroinflammation, due to the fact that our substrains have different neuroinflammation responses, may play a role in these differences in our drug taking. And lastly, we see that all doses of A33 significantly attenuated the number of reinforcers earned, and as well as I mentioned, the milligrams per kilogram meth that they actually were able to consume. And this was regardless of the sex or strain. So it really shows that this A33 could be a promising therapeutic for reducing meth intake. And some future directions that we are currently investigating or would like to investigate in the future is, first, we'd like to look at how A33 may impact withdrawal from and reinstatement of methamphetamine. So like in the human population, there's periods where people are not taking the drug and then may take it again. So we'd like to know whether or not our A33 can continue to attenuate this methamphetamine taking even after they've not taken the drug for a little while. Also, we want to look at the molecular mechanisms underpinning the effects of A33 and PD4B inhibition in general. So it's really important to look at what actually is going on in the brain and be able to see how this drug is actually impacting specific molecular targets and specific molecular mechanisms of neuroinflammation. And lastly, we'd like to confirm this methamphetamine neuroinflammation differences between our substrains. In a similar way, we want to look at how our substrains and our sexes are actually changing, how the differences in their neuroinflammation are impacting this methamphetamine taking as well. And thank you.
Thanks, Kevin, for the great talk. Does anyone have questions for Kevin? If you do, you can type in the Q&A. Okay, we got our first question from Evan. How long would it take to potentially send to test this in humans?
I think it would take, quite a while to actually get to a human testing phase, because as a lot of neuroscientists will know that, from the idea of having a drug and being able to test it in animals to actually getting into a clinical human trials takes a really long time. It takes a lot of studies. It takes a lot of making sure that things are working, especially because we want to make sure that, we don't see these deleterious effects in, different rodent models, and making sure that that doesn't translate into potential effects in human models as well. Um, a good example of that would be like there was drugs that went to market. There was a cannabinergic drug that actually went to clinical trials in Europe for humans, and it actually caused really bad deleterious side effects. So it's important to make sure that these effects in animal models before moving to human trials.
We got another question from Flora. I'm sure you mentioned this, but does A33 inhibit neuron inflammation? And which one has more robust inflammation response, B6 and J or the other strains?
Yeah, so for that, first I'll mention the second part where our B6 J mice have they're going to have a longer immune response, but it's a less robust immune response. It's similar to a female response, I believe. And what's the first part of that question? Sorry.
Does A33 inhibit neuroinflammation?
That is a good question. I'm not quite sure what all in the literature specifically, if they've looked at, especially for this specific drug, whether it's actually causing a decrease in the neuroinflammation itself. There's plenty of studies showing that it's decreasing this intake, but I don't know if the underpinning molecular mechanisms have been parsed out quite yet.
Okay. Thanks, Kevin. I think that's all the questions we have, and we'll hand it over to the MC.
Alrighty, thank you.
Hi, everyone. I am going to be talking about our next presenter, who is Suyi Liang. So Suyi graduated from the University of Washington in Seattle in 2018 with a double major in psychology and early childhood and family studies. Suyi now works with David Sherman and Hee-Jung Kim studying culture in various high-impact topics, and we'll hear a little bit more about that today. Something super impressive about Suyi is that she is multilingual. She speaks English, Mandarin, Malay, Cantonese, and a little bit of Korean, and that's 4 languages, 5 if we're counting Korean. You can't win them all, and while Suyi excels linguistically, she admits to being an extraordinarily bad actress. When acting, Suyi said she can't stop breaking character and laughing. As someone who has both witnessed and joined in on Suyi's contagious giggle fits, I think I'd likely find Suyi's knack for laughing out of character more entertaining than the line she was supposed to recite. Sorry, this cat. I also just want to point out this super cute baby picture. I think it kind of provides a glimpse into the origins of our struggling young thespian. Even baby Suyi was kind of serving moody, broody, struggling actress vibes, and I'm really into it. So with that, take it away, Suyi.
Hi, sorry, can you hear me? Okay, cool. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Vicky. Hi, everyone. Welcome to my Minicon talk. The project that I will be presenting today is titled The Role of Collectivism in Individuals' Compliance with COVID-19 Non-Pharmaceutical Interventions. Let me take you back to 2020, a year that I believe none of us have ever expected and would ever forget. Cities that were once bustling with traffic and pedestrians were suddenly empty. Lines were formed outside grocery stores. Food and toilet papers were taken off shelves and hoarded because nobody knows when their city is going to lock down. Nobody knew how long the pandemic was going to last. We didn't even know if there's a vaccine on site. What we could really do was to rely on non-pharmaceutical interventions like wearing a face covering, or in some countries, using digital contact tracing. But despite their effectiveness, these non-pharmaceutical interventions come with a cost. For example, because digital contact tracing establishes a connection with you and your close contacts using Bluetooth, a main concern was that it will potentially invade your privacy. Wearing a face covering, on the other hand, may be uncomfortable, and some may even view it as a violation of independence. Further, there are some theoretical reasons as to why we choose digital contact tracing and face covering as our key compliance behaviors. First, as we mentioned earlier, both measures impose personal costs, like the potential violation of privacy, to achieve a more communal goal of curbing the spread of COVID-19. Second, both measures require high public compliance, and specifically, more than 60% of the population has to opt in for digital contact tracing to be optimally effective, and the goal is to achieve a 95% population use of face covering in public. So we theorize that these non-pharmaceutical interventions have characteristics that align better with collectivistic values. Collectivism is often characterized as the prioritization of communal over personal goals, but these characteristics, how this characteristic is manifested is not well understood. There are many ways that collectivists prioritize their community. For example, they tend to perceive greater consensus among their in-group members and align their behaviors accordingly. Collectivists are also more driven by social norms. So if they think that other people are behaving in a certain way, they may follow suit as well. Lastly, because of the greater emphasis on obedience among collectivists, they tend to listen to the authority more. So in the context of COVID-19, collectivism on the national level has been associated with greater compliance with non-pharmaceutical interventions. So for example, Wu and colleagues just published a paper in PNAS demonstrating that more collectivistic states within the United States and more collectivistic countries were associated with greater mask usage. Similarly, Im and Chen found that more collectivistic countries were associated with greater social distancing behaviors. But it's unclear how and why collectivism is associated with compliance with these NPIs. Even though there are national level differences, we still observe a lot of variability within a country on the individual level. So we focus on using collectivism as an individual level orientation to investigate its relationship with compliance. We hypothesize that individual level collectivism predicts greater compliance with non-pharmaceutical interventions across different cultural contexts. We also want to explore different aspects of collectivism and how it explains the relationship between collectivism and compliance. Specifically, because collectivists tend to prioritize others over self, we expect them to have greater concern for their community health. Collectivists are also more sensitive to social norms, so we might expect people to see more people in their community complying and more likely to do it themselves. Lastly, because these non-pharmaceutical interventions are most often imposed by the government, they may place greater trust and perceive their government as doing a better job and therefore comply to a greater extent. So we recruited about 2,200 participants from 4 different countries: the United States, Singapore, Japan, and Germany. And in our analyses, we controlled for country-level differences using multi-level modeling. And we also controlled for individualism and demographic variables such as age, gender, majority group status, income, years of education, and political ideology. There are also a few cross-cultural variability that we need to address. For instance, Singapore has a really strong government enforcement. It has imposed a countrywide lockdown since the beginning of the pandemic and has mandated the use of contact tracing in public spaces. There are also certain pre-COVID norms, like wearing a face covering in Japan, that has been established pre-COVID. I also want to note the different stages of digital contact tracing app implementation at the time of data collection. So Singapore's digital contact tracing app has been launched for a while and is mandated. Japan's and Germany's app were relatively new at the time of data collection, and the US has no official contact tracing app yet. And as we see from the graph, there is a huge variability in the COVID-19 situation at the time of data collection. So the US was on the rise exponentially, and Japan and Germany were gradually increasing, whereas Singapore has just passed its peak and was in decline. So that being said, there is a lot of things that were beyond our control during our data collection and accounts for differences across countries. So for our predictor variable, we used a scale from Oiseman and colleague to measure collectivism, and there were 8 items in total, ranging from 1 strongly disagree to strongly agree. An example item include, it is important for me to think of myself as a member of my religious, national, or ethnic group. The alpha was pretty high, and the mean and standard deviation is a composite across all 4 countries. For our first mediator variable, concern for community health, it was measured on a single item scales. Participants respond to the question, in considering the use of digital contact tracing, what factor is more important to you, ranging from 0, protecting myself from COVID-19, to 100, protecting my community from COVID-19. The same question was asked for the likelihood of wearing a face covering in public spaces. Our second mediator, perceived social norm, is measured by participants responding to the questions, if your local health authority were to administer the use of digital contact tracing, what proportion of people in your local community do you think would opt in? So they report their perceived percent of community members who complied, ranging from 0 to 100%. And once again, the same question was asked for the likelihood of wearing a face covering. Lastly, our third mediator, trust and perceived government efficacy, was measured using an adapted scale from Q. There were 7 items in total, ranging from 1 strongly disagree to 6 strongly agree. Example items include, I generally think the government is run for the benefit of all people in this country. Pretty high alpha, also mean and standard deviation is a composite across all 4 countries. So next we turn to our results. We conducted a hierarchical linear regression controlling for country-level differences and various demographic variables that I mentioned previously, and with collectivism as our predictor variable, and decision to opt in as our outcome. So we found that collectivism predicts greater opt-in to digital contact tracing, and also greater likelihood of wearing a face covering when it's not required but recommended. And in this context, we operationalize it as in public spaces where social interactions still occur. Next, we turn to our question, what aspect of collectivism explains the relationship? We found that collectivisms predict greater concern for community health, greater perceived social norms, and greater trust and perceived government efficacy. But when we place all 3 mediators together, we found that concern for community health did not mediate the relationship between collectivism and opting in. On the other hand, perceived social norms and trust in government significantly explain the relationship between both variables. After controlling the mediators, the association between collectivism and opting in was not significant, suggesting a full mediation. So the same pattern was found for wearing a face covering when it's not required. Again, collectivism predict greater concern for community health, greater perceived social norms, and greater trust and perceived government efficacy. But concern for community health did not explain the relationship between collectivism and wearing a face covering, but perceived social norms and trust in government explain the relationship between both variables. Again, after accounting for all 3 mediators, the association between collectivism and wearing face covering was not significant, also suggesting a full mediation. So regardless of participants' country of origin, more collectivistic individuals tend to engage in non-pharmaceutical interventions more, and it's explained by collectivists' greater perceived consensus with their in-group members, greater trust and perceived efficacy of the government, but not the greater concern for community health. A reason why we think that concern for community health did not explain the relationship between both variables was that this consideration was not as prominent or directly observable compared to social norms and the government's effort. So there are a few theoretical contributions and practical implications. First, individual level collectivism is powerful in encouraging compliance across different cultural contexts, especially when these decisions involve tension between personal and collective benefit. Second, even if we cannot change people's cultural orientation, we identified 2 psychological mechanisms that may influence people's compliance. For example, we can shape the social norm by promoting the targeted interventions and making it more visible, or even be more transparent about governmental effort and increase communication and engagement with the public to earn their trust. So as we are waiting for a return to normalcy, whatever it may mean in a post-COVID world, by just highlighting that we are stronger together, we can create a sense of community and greater purpose. Lastly, I would like to thank my advisors, Dr. David Sherman and Hyung Kim, my collaborators from Singapore, Japan, and Germany, the Sherman and Culture Lab members, the USCSB MRCI grant for supporting this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Sui, for this is a very interesting research. So anyone who has a question about Sui can type their question in the Q&A box. Okay, so we got our first question from David. Can you share a bit more about why those countries were chosen?
Yeah, so as like I discussed previously, that there are cross-country differences in how collectivism predicts compliance to these key non-pharmaceutical interventions. And the reason we choose four countries, so 2 higher on individualism and 2 higher on collectivism, is to compare whether or not collectivism is on the individual level is robust and can predict compliance across these countries that vary on the more national level of collectivism. So we did find the more robust relationship suggesting that collectivism does indeed predict greater compliance even within one country.
Thanks. Our next question is from Nancy. Do you expect similar findings for vaccinations?
I would expect so, yes. So given that vaccine is also one of a measure that will impose some personal costs, so there are vaccine hesitance and concerns. So I would think that if we could highlight some communal benefits of getting vaccinated to protect your like your family, or even making sure or like increasing visibility in statistic of how many people have been vaccinated, maybe that would reduce vaccine hesitancy and encourage more people to get vaccinated.
Okay, I think we have time for another question. Have the degree to which some culture are collectivist changed since COVID?
Has the degree to which some cultures are collect? What does that mean? Sorry, can you elaborate? Oh, do you mean that countries become more collectivistic since COVID? So I think there are previous research that supports, that if a region has more pathogen prevalence in that region or society, then the society will become more collectivistic. And I think that might be the case for COVID as well, because COVID is such a threat that is very disruptive in how how society functions. Maybe there are some changes as to how society's cultural orientation changed, and perhaps that would support the pathogen prevalence hypotheses.
Okay, thanks again, Sui.
Thank you.
Yeah, so there's a couple more questions, but we don't have time for that. So you guys can feel free to talk to Sui afterwards about the question.
All righty. People see me? Yeah, I'm imagining people probably see me. All righty. Our next presenter is Kelvin Lamb. Kelvin received his bachelor's in psychology, sensation, and perception from UCSD. He is currently working alongside his advisor, Tommy Sprague, on researching the integration of items from working memory to long-term memory, More specifically, he is investigating the patterns of activation that underlie memory representations and how these patterns change when information is recorded in memory. Now, Calvin sent me a very long list of fun facts. I'll only mention a few that aren't too crazy and don't need more background info, but I'm going to keep it a stack. The others are really wild. So first off, Kelvin gained his passion for cognitive neuroscience after taking a class from his academic grandfather, John Sorensis, weird flex, in pursuit of his dream to be a K-pop star. He is currently teaching himself Korean. He has a legitimate shot at this because apparently he is a concert pianist and was first chair for playing the cello in high school. I've lived with the man for almost a year now, didn't know any of this. If he wasn't in graduate school, he would be goat farming in the Romanian countryside, probably book his travel with Daniel Thayer. And lastly, he put 800 hours into Animal Crossing within the first month that it was out. Pretty impressive. All right, Kelvin, it is now your time to shine.
Oh, all right. How do I start PowerPoint? All right. Hi, everyone. Big shoes to live up to, I guess. So I'll be talking about comparing spatial working memory performance for simple stimuli and real-world objects. So visual working memory is our ability to maintain and manipulate information over brief delays in service of some behavioral goal. One of the most commonly studied effects in working memory research is the set size effect, which is the idea that increasing the number of items that a person has to hold in their working memory will decrease their overall performance on this task. To leverage these effects, most researchers use simple stimuli such as colored squares or orientation gradings to test the effects that they see. The reason we do so is simple. It's trivially easy to create a well-controlled stimulus set when your stimuli only consist of one or two independent parameters that are manipulable in a continuous stimulus space. However, one criticism of this method is that we as humans don't go around perceiving simple two-feature stimuli our entire lives. We look at real-world objects that have mid-level features such as textures, high-level features such as the shape of the stimuli and semantic information associated with the stimuli. There are researchers that hypothesize that naturalistic stimuli would show a different pattern of results as compared to simple stimuli, due to the fact of any combination of these stimulus features can hypothetically improve our working memory performance. So one question central to today's talk is, does our working memory treat complex objects the same as simple stimuli? And there's some evidence to suggest this is true. In the Brady et al. 2016 study, they find that objects benefit from increased processing, but color squares do not. In a lot of visual working memory tasks, stimuli presentations are typically around 200 milliseconds, usually to discourage eye movements when there are multiple items presented. And what Brady et al. Hypothesized is that at this short of an encoding period, it's not enough time for participants to really perceive these or process these any different than they would a colored square. But maybe at longer encoding times, we might see a difference in behavior. And they found that at 200 milliseconds, the performance between the colored squares and the real world objects were not significantly different from one another. But at 1 second and 2 seconds, we do see a benefit for objects. So it does seem like this extra time benefited the objects only. So we have reason to believe that objects behave differently than simple stimuli, but simple stimuli and objects also differ based on how much meaning can be attached to this, or how many brain regions that they stimulate and which brain regions they stimulate. So we know that viewing colors activates early visual cortex, and that viewing objects activates visual cortex, some areas in the parietal lobe, and some ventral temporal areas as well. And these areas that objects stimulate are spatially selective and retinotopially organized. To borrow from Daniel's presentation, we can think of them as a set of spatially selective maps. The object map isn't a real map that kind of exists. It's more of a rhetorical device, but you can think of it as a sum of all these other maps. Even though parietal and ventral temporal areas have lower spatial resolution than primary visual cortex, it might be the case that just having these redundant spatial encodings improve the spatial precision as compared to colored squares. So our question is, are spatial positions of objects remembered more precisely than colored squares? And to answer this question, we had subjects do this continuous report task. And so on each stimulus presentation period, we showed 1, 2, or 6 items. They were either all objects or all colored squares. After a brief delay, we probed one of the objects and the subject had to drag and drop that image into the right location, into the remembered location. And we also wanted to validate the result from the 2016 Brady paper. So we also asked subjects to do a 2FC task with the same stimulus presentation. So after the stimulus presentation, instead of the continuous report task, they would be probed with the location and 2 items. And so they had to indicate which one of those items by pressing left to right on the keyboard as to which one of those items was remembered. So the way we analyzed this was by using, the way we analyzed the continuous report experiment was using this mixture model. And so how we look at the results for the continuous report model or continuous report experiment is that we measure the angular difference of the response and plot it on a histogram. And it ends up looking something like this. Approximately normal Van Mises distribution with large tails. And what the mixture model does is that it takes the height of these tails and it just designates those as the guess rate. And it measures the standard deviation of the normal distribution left over and calls that the precision. Standard deviation and precision being, of course, inversely related. As standard deviation increases, precision decreases, and vice versa. In the 2FC experiment, we just measured the accuracy, so percent correct of trials. Okay, so let's preview the results here. So we should expect to see a set size effect. So as set size increases, we should see the precision of these reports decrease. And if our hypothesis is true, we should see that objects have a better spatial recall than colors. And we don't really expect to see an interaction effect between the two of them. If our hypothesis is not true and objects and colors have the same spatial precision, we should see results look something like this. Okay, so let's look at the raw data before we get into the model parameter estimates. So we can see here that the set size effect was reliably replicated. We see that set size 1 has a more precise response distribution than at set size 2 for colors. And let's compare now between stimulus types for colors and objects. So it does seem to be the case that there is a slight precision increase when you go from colors to objects at both set size 1 and set size 2, just by visual inspection. So once we measure these standard deviations and we plot them out, it looks like we get exactly our predicted results. We have a main effect of set size and a main effect of stimulus type and no interaction. And so we conclude that spatial working memory for objects is in fact more precise than for colored squares. The effect is somewhat small, but significant nonetheless. We don't see any effect of guess rate, but we didn't make any predictions about the guess rate. Okay, so let's preview the results for the 2FC test. Since we did see a benefit for objects as compared to colored squares, we do first expect to see the set size effect replicated because that's a very reliable effect. But we also expect to see objects having higher accuracy than for colors. Again, if our hypothesis is false, then we should see something like this, where we see the set size effect, but no effect of stimulus type. What's kind of odd here is that we do see the set size effect, but we do not see a stimulus type effect. As this was a replication of the Brady 2016 paper, it's sort of odd that we weren't able to see the same effect they do, but So it turns out accuracy was the same for objects and for colors. So as some of you might be thinking, we did take the most simple stimuli and we compared it to a relatively complex stimuli with so many more features added. So one thing that we're thinking of doing next is to kind of pull apart this effect and see what's really driving this. So one thing that we might predict is that all features contribute equally to spatial precision. It's might be the case that it's literally the number of features and the number of redundant representation, which is driving these effects. It could be also the case that only one of these features is driving spatial precision. So the addition of perhaps texture is what's causing this effect. Or something else could be that semantic meaning, something unique to objects that other stimuli don't have, is also might be what's driving this effect. So in summary, the question we asked today is, are spatial positions of objects remembered more precisely than colored squares? Spatial recall for objects is more precise than colored squares, is what we determined. So thanks to my lab, thanks for all your attention, and yeah, that's all I have.
Thanks, Kelvin. It's very interesting research. So if you have a question for Kelvin, please type that in the Q&A box. Okay, so we got our first question from Evan. Do you think some people may put more effort for spatial accuracy for some type of stimulus versus others?
I don't think so, because it's not readily apparent to the subjects what we're really studying in this experiment. Like, unless you really knew kind of like the ideas behind what's happening here, it would just look like we're just throwing different stimuli at them. That's kind of like my interpretation of it. But yeah, I guess we wouldn't know unless we asked.
The next question from Mary. Why did you choose to look at spatial position of objects rather than, say, doing a change detection task?
Yeah, so the idea behind looking at spatial precision is kind of rooted more in the idea of these feature maps. There's been a lot of like recent research looking at how these redundant representations might be privileging some stimuli over another, and we thought that that was an interesting thing to look at in regards to spatial precision instead of just yeah. So essentially what I'm trying to get at here is that this was more of a way to look at the idea behind these feature maps and redundant representations. Yeah.
Okay. Our third question from Kyle. Could your effects be driven by participants finding the task more engaging when looking at objects rather than squares?
I think there might be some truth to that. Perhaps not particularly more engaging, but one thing that we've been thinking about is that one particular feature about the stimuli of objects versus colored squares is that it might be easier to kind of more precisely click the correct location for objects other than colored squares, because something that we did was we had them drag and drop those into the correct location. So it might be maybe easier to line up the stimuli if it has more interesting outlines as compared to just a colored square, or it might be easier to place those as compared to the simple stimuli.
Okay. I think that's all the question we have. Thanks again, Kelvin. I'm going to hand it over to the MC.
Righty, great presentation there. Up next, we will have Todd Kipton presenting the Harry J. Carlisle Award. I hope I said that correctly, and if I didn't, I apologize. So I will hand it over to Todd.
Hi there, thanks, Jordan. It's my distinct honor to award the Harry J. Carlisle Award this year to Julian Gerson, because he's an outstanding student in my lab, and I'm very happy to have him. For those that aren't familiar with the award, it's in honor of a former faculty member who is characterized by several critical qualities for making it in academia, but also including his contribution to the area of neuroscience and behavior as a community. And so the student is selected by the NMB faculty in terms of representing those qualities. That is typically sound scholarship. And on that case, Julian has been outstanding in his coursework. In fact, he's taken not only courses in our department, but also in several other really tough areas of graduate study, like the bioengineering program on campus, the track record of research. And again, Julian's really been outstanding in this case, really leading my research group, particularly in the last year. That is after the start of the pandemic, when I had a postdoc and a experienced lab technician, as well as Julian, all performing a number of surgical procedures to test biosensors. I ended up with the postdoc and tech leaving, so Julian's really been carrying the lab for the last year and a half. So he's just done an outstanding job of supporting not just himself, but my two new graduate students, as well as several postdocs and graduate students in collaborative research. So again, his research track record has really stepped up. He's operating, I think, well above a graduate level. And then also related to that, his community efforts. Again, he's been training people in my lab and supporting collaborations with people in chemistry and engineering that really have trying to move forward our ability to monitor molecules in the body, particularly in the brain, which we hope will sort of evolve neuroscience in a number of ways. So with that, I'm really happy to award Julian this present Julian this award. He's certainly a very deserving candidate. And with every year, it was always debated on who the most deserving candidate is. So it's a competitive award to receive from our faculty and really represents several years of hard work, not just in terms of one's own research and scholastic achievements, but in terms of contributions to the entire community. And with that, I'll pass it back to Jordan.
Fantastic. Congrats, Julian. Been a while since we talked. Good to see you're doing well.
Surviving.
All righty. Well, next what we have is lunch. I don't know what other people are going to be eating. Unfortunately, we're not serving anything. But you'll be back by 12:45.
More coffee, right?
No, or coffee. Daniel's, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. It's not a espresso. I don't know what I said. It's either a cappuccino or espresso machine. I don't drink coffee. But anyway, that's still open to people if they want it. Hope you guys have good meals. If people have suggestions on what to get delivered, throw it in the chat. And yeah, mimosas are still acceptable. And I hope everybody's having a great time. I am. And see you guys at 12:45. Oh, someone raised their hand. Is that a question? I am echoing. Oh, let me see if I can rectify that.
Am I still echoing? Surround sound? Brenda, I'm sorry to tell you this. I think it might be you. We can have a tech person come. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and get started now. And all righty, presenting next, we have Sophie Peterson. Sophie received her bachelor's in psychology from San Jose State University, as well as a master's in experimental psychology from Cal State San Bernardino. She is currently working alongside her advisor, Ron Keflin, on investigating the neural mechanisms involved in learning and decision-making. Now, her investigative abilities are not only applicable to science. In fact, when watching Law and Order SVU, Sophie can figure out who is guilty within the first 5 minutes of the show, which, to be honest, kind of sounds like she just ruins the show if you watch it with it. But Sophie, I actually have a question for you. Hopefully you're here. Sophie,
Yeah.
does your ability to guess who's guilty, does that apply just to SVU or like other iterations of Law and Order?
Just SVU, because that's the best one. I have to admit, I don't watch any of the other ones. SVU is definitely the best. So, but
Okay.
most any true crime documentary, I usually know who does it. So
Gotcha. Well, it's impressive nonetheless. So with that, you can go ahead and give your presentation.
okay, great. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sophie, and I am going to be talking to you today about the work we're doing in the Kieflin Lab. We're investigating the neural underpinnings of context-dependent discrimination. So when your cell phone rings, you're faced with two choices. Do you answer it or do you not answer it? One way to help you make that decision is to consider the context or the surroundings that you're in. So are you in the middle of listening to all the second years present their really hard work during Minicon, or are you just sitting on your couch in the middle of another Netflix binge? Using that contextual information can kind of help you decide and make the correct decision. So of course, it's probably not best to answer your cell phone in the middle of a talk, but it's probably safe to go ahead and answer your phone if you're just sitting at home. Now, this is certainly a really low stakes example of how you can use context to inform your decisions. And there's certainly more instances where it's more critical to be able to utilize that information. And in fact, we do see that some neuropsychiatric disorders such as schizophrenia, PTSD, and autism are actually impaired in the ability to use context. But the one main question that our lab is interested in looking at is how exactly does context acquire and exert influence on ambiguous stimuli during decision making? So before I get much farther, I do want to clarify what exactly I mean by a context. For some people, a context can be an environment or a place, but for us, a context is any information that actually modifies the predictive status of a cue in relation to its potential outcome. So basically any information that can change the meaning and response to incoming stimuli. So how exactly can context modify these predictive status? One way is through positive modulation. So in this example of context A, say a chamber light in an operant chamber is on when paired with QX, some sort of auditory cue. When those two are paired together, the animal will receive a reward. But if QX is paired alone in the absence of A, it's unrewarded. And we can see that this context actually modulates the response to this incoming stimuli of the auditory cue and then increases the response of reward-seeking behavior when the context is present and with QX, as opposed to when QX is presented alone. This can also happen with negative modulation. So kind of in the opposite fashion where now context A when paired with QX is unrewarded, but when QX is presented alone, it is rewarded. So again, we see now that this context is negatively modulating the association and decreasing the response to that conditioned context cue pairing. We can actually also see this in the same fashion when we put them together. So we compare together positive and negative modulation and see a really interesting phenomenon where now context A when paired with QX is still rewarded. And when X is paired alone, it's unrewarded. But now we introduce a secondary cue, QY, something that is distinct from QX, another auditory cue perhaps. And when that QY is presented alongside context A, it's unrewarded. But when it's presented alone, it is rewarded. So again, now this context is serving to both negatively and positively modulate the association between two distinct cues and the reward outcome. And we can see that this behavior is actually pretty distinct when they are measured their conditional response to the reward-seeking behavior, where in context A is paired with QX, we see a higher rate of responding compared to A and Y. And when context A is absent, there's less responding to QX alone compared to when Y is presented alone. Now we have a lot of behavioral data really to support this idea that context-dependent discrimination does exist and it is reliable. However, we have less information about the biological aspect that's going on, those neural circuits that might be involved in the context-dependent decision-making. There is plenty of biological information on these more simple linear associations with the direct association of the X to the reward. However, we don't know as much about what's going on once we introduce the secondary cue and our context to kind of indicate that reward availability. So this is really that big question that our lab is interested in is what are these neural circuits that are involved? But before we can actually investigate the neural circuits, we have to first make sure that this behavioral response is happening. So to do that, we've established a Pavlovian association task where animals are placed in an operant chamber for 80 minutes. During those 80 minutes, 2 separate contexts will be alternated for 2 minutes at a time. So context A, the chamber light is flashing on and off, and in context no A, the chamber light remains off the entire time. During those 2 minutes, 2 distinct auditory cues will be played. So QX is like a little clicking noise, and QY is sort of a white noise. So 2 distinct cues. And then based on which condition the animal is placed in, that will dictate which cue and context combination is rewarded. So if the animal is placed in the context-dependent discrimination with a single outcome, this is similar to the previous figure that I showed you, where the animal is rewarded with context A is paired with X, and then when Y is presented alone. We also had a simple discrimination group where now the animal just has to learn that X is associated with the reward irrelevant of the context. So anytime X is played, whether context A is there or context A is not there, they receive a reward and Y is never rewarded. We also had a no discrimination group. Now in this group, no matter which context cue combination was presented, there was always an equal likelihood that the cue and context combination would be rewarded. So there really wasn't any better cue context combination. There was always a likelihood that they would receive the reward. Now for the context dependent discrimination with a single outcome, there was evidence to suggest that this is very complicated for animals and it is very difficult for them to actually learn. So to kind of facilitate the acquisition and kind of compare the possibility of some different cognitive processes going on, we also included this context-dependent discrimination with a dual outcome. So with this dual outcome, the same context and cues combinations are rewarded as the single outcome, but now one context has a distinct reward compared to the other context. So for example, context A is always rewarded with the liquid reward, while context no A receives a food reward. So 2 distinct things that facilitate acquisition, but could also be tapping into different cognitive processes. So for this particular task, we had several measures, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to be talking to you about the time the animals spent in port after the cue. So we found that animals were able to solve the context-dependent discriminations. So here are these figures. You can see that they are representing the % of time spent in port in the final 3 sessions. So once the animals have acquired this association and are considered learners, we can see that the animals are responding at a higher rate to those rewarded trials where the A paired with X and the no A paired with Y. Those are going to be showed a higher rate of response in both the single outcome and the dual outcome groups. And you can see the much lower response rate in the unrewarded trials. Likewise, you can see that the time spent in port for the simple discrimination group is much higher for that X cue. So when X is presented, you can clearly see a preference compared to Y, where they're showing basically no response to Y at all. And lastly, we can see pretty even discrimination between the different context and cue combinations for the no discrimination group. Now, the animals didn't kind of learn these associations as quickly for all of the conditions. The simple discrimination was obviously much easier to learn compared to the other 2 more complex discriminations, with our context-dependent single outcome being the most difficult to learn, where it took animals the longest to learn that. And also kind of looking a little bit further into this particular discrepancy, we did find that animals in the context-dependent single outcome group, we actually saw some sex differences. So females were actually less likely to learn this particular task. Only 35% of our females in this group actually reached criterion compared to 69% of our males. So we weren't exactly looking for sex differences to begin with. We were kind of just doing our due diligence of including males and females like the NIH tells us to do. So we are going to definitely pursue this in our future line of research to see what's really potentially going on here. So now that we have established the animals can actually learn this task, we want to now identify the large-scale brain network that's engaged in context-dependent behavior. So to do that, we've decided to use CFOS as a proxy marker for neuronal cell activity. And CFOS levels peak around 120 minutes after activity. So 120 minutes after the animals start their final day of behavioral training, they're perfused to really preserve that signal. And then using an immunohistological approach, we stain for both NUN and CFOS. Now NUN is a marker for neuronal cell bodies, and then CFOS is again that marker of cell activity. And then after imaging, we then can quantify and map those CFOS positive neurons to kind of establish this larger functional network analysis to see which brain regions might be at play in these different discrimination tasks. We are approaching this in an unbiased way, which means that we are quantifying the CFOS in roughly 63 different brain regions per rat. So this is a very heavy undertaking for us, and it has been taking us a very long time. So I just did briefly want to touch on one particular brain region we have had some interesting findings in for today. So one interesting finding we had was in a brain region known as the colostrum. So as you can see here in this figure, it's showing the density of CFOS positive neurons per millimeter squared in this particular brain region. And you can see that there are much higher rates of this density in the more simple tasks, the simple discrimination and the no discrimination tasks, compared to our context dependent groups. So what might be causing that? First, we can kind of discuss what exactly the colostrum is. The colostrum is a very highly connected brain region, especially considering its size. And it establishes both bidirectional connections with the entire neocortex. And there are definitely some confusion about what exactly might be the function of the colostrum. There is evidence that it could be in saliency processing, selective attention, cognitive control, but we really aren't really sure. There is some evidence to suggest that the colostral inputs can actually dampen the sensory cortex responses. So kind of using that idea, we have a sort of working hypothesis of where we are right now, that we suggest that the colostrum is part of an attention grabbing process where the most salient stimulus activates the colostrum to reduce attention to any other sensory modalities that might be going on. So we're hypothesizing that this system is fully engaged in simple forms of discrimination, and animals can afford to pay attention to just one single sensory modality at a time. Like in our example, the simple discrimination, they just need to pay attention to that auditory cue. But we believe that when animals are participating in a context-dependent discrimination, the colostrum is actually being inhibited by this prelimbic cortex, specifically the ACC, and a kind of top-down attentional control. And this actually allows the animals to maintain the attention to multiple sensory modalities by quieting down the colostrum and reducing its activity. So we believe that we're going to continue looking at this pathway to see that if we inactivate the ACC to the colostrum pathway, how that might affect behavior. So in conclusion, based on our behavioral data, we can see that different forms of discrimination are presumably engaging different cognitive processes. There are some sex differences observed exclusively in the single outcome context dependent discrimination group. And lastly, some preliminary CFOS results suggest a critical role in the colostrum in this context dependent discrimination. So thank you, and any questions?
Awesome. Great job, Sophie. That was great. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, like we've been doing, feel free to write them in the Q&A, and I'll be happy to ask Sophie. Sophie, I have a quick question unrelated to your presentation.
Yeah.
I also really like true crime and SVU. do you have a favorite character on that show?
I mean, it's probably got to be Benson. I mean, just, you know, we all want to be her.
She's such a good role model. I love her.
I listened to a podcast about SVU. I'll message you about it later.
Yes, I think is it on the Exactly Right network? Yeah.
It's one of my new favorites.
I've been meaning to get into that one. Awesome. Thank you, Sophie.
Yeah.
If anybody has any questions related to her research, oh, perfect. Evan has one. So Evan asks, why do you think some can learn the context while others don't? Do you think it has to do with the neural network?
I mean, that's possibly what we're going to be doing to look and see if that is something going on. I'm more interested to see, I mean, if I talk to Dr. Kippen about it, the sex differences, if there's something with the estrous cycle potentially going on with the females, even though this is going on across longer days, perhaps the days that they are finishing it are in that cycle where their type of learning that they're utilizing is a little different. So yeah, it could be the neural networks that are involved, kind of looking more at those specific brain regions to kind of compare and see the learners versus non-learners is definitely what we're going to be going to.
Great, thank you, Sophie. Any other questions for Sophie? We have time for maybe like another question if anybody has any. All right, well, if not, feel free to, email Sophie with any questions that anybody has. Thank you so much, Sophie, for your
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to be introducing our next presenter, and that is Sierra Fiesel. So we're going to do this one a little bit differently because I want everybody to take a second to look at this amazing picture. So yeah, just look at this outfit. I have a couple of things to say about it. So Sierra clearly came onto this earth blazing, serving us with ruffles, Dorothy-inspired gingham, an oversized bow, Paddington Bear embroidery, and a romper with the classic Pooh Bear Head in a Honey Pot series. If this isn't the pinnacle of childhood nostalgia mismatch, I don't know what is. So the thought, care, and I don't know why this is the word that kept coming to mind, precision that went into this outfit is just, it's laudable. So yeah, apologies for the digression, but I would have been remiss to not break this down because this is a sartorial masterpiece. And yeah, I think, Sierra, I think this is like the pinnacle of your fashion in your life. Yeah. Okay, now we can talk about Sierra. So Sierra graduated from UC Berkeley in 2017 with a degree in cognitive science. After receiving her MA in social sciences at U Chicago, Sierra came back to UCSB, where she works with Diane Mackey and Brenda Major to study prejudice, discrimination, ally identity, and intergroup interactions. In her free time, Sierra likes going to Disneyland and dressing her dog, Minnie, in bandanas. Sierra, we can only hope that you're providing for Minnie the outfit planning, care, and nurturing at a level that is tantamount to what you got when other people dressed you. So the bar is set. Okay, Sierra, take it away.
Thanks, Vicki, for that introduction. I'll go ahead and share my screen. I feel my outfit isn't living up to the hype today. Can everyone see my slides okay? Okay, cool, thanks, Paige. So hi everyone, today I'll be presenting a project that longitudinally examines the predictors of a relatively new concept known as status uncertainty. So past research has well established that there are health disparities between individuals from high and low SES backgrounds. Higher SES is consistently associated with better psychological health and well-being, as well as better physical health. And these effects have been demonstrated when SES is assessed both objectively as well as subjectively. This research implies that as individuals achieve upward mobility, health should improve. However, this is not what is found among racial and ethnic minorities from low SES backgrounds. Research on social mobility demonstrates that there are actually health costs associated with climbing the social ladder for racial and ethnic minority individuals. One context that has been well researched is college, because this is a common period of social mobility that's seen as a gateway to opening opportunities to the future. However, college completion is associated with poorer rather than better physical health for ethnic minority students compared to those who do not attend. A potential reason for this is that social mobility is often characterized by discrimination experiences. As racial and ethnic minority individuals from low SES backgrounds enter into these new middle and upper class contexts, they often face subtle and overt discrimination, which further harms their health. They also face unique challenges related to their background, such as cultural mismatch. Cultural mismatch describes the clash between the interdependent norms of their working class backgrounds and the independent norms of middle and upper class college environments. These various experiences highlight that status change can be stressful, especially for racial and ethnic minority individuals. And we need a framework to better understand these complex experiences. In 2017, Destin and colleagues developed a framework with this purpose in mind, known as status-based identity. Status-based identity can help shed light on why social mobility leads to these negative health outcomes among racial ethnic minorities. By definition, status-based identity is the subjective meaning and value that people attach to their SES, and it draws from 3 different types of identity. The first is narrative identity, which allows individuals to tell a coherent story about their life. So in the context of status, this looks like drawing connections between one's past and future SES to make sense of one's changing place in society. It also draws from social identity, which captures the importance of feeling a meaningful connection with groups that people value. This includes forming connections with people in a new social context, such as college, while also maintaining connections with one's past environment, like friends and family back home. Lastly, status-based identity draws from future identity, which captures people's vision of their future self and their future life, which often contains an expectation of one's future social standing. So periods of social mobility, like attending college, can challenge these different aspects of status-based identity, leading to status uncertainty. Status uncertainty is characterized by feelings of uncertainty around where one stands in society. Emerging research on this topic demonstrates that higher levels of status uncertainty are associated with lower well-being, including lower self-esteem and lower satisfaction with life among college students. It's also predictive of negative academic outcomes, including academic efficacy and poorer academic achievement. This suggests that the experience of status uncertainty may help explain why social mobility can be costly to disadvantaged groups. Based on this emerging research, we have a sense of some of the effects of status uncertainty. However, no research has examined what leads to status uncertainty in the first place. And in the current research, we aim to answer this question. What experiences during periods of social mobility, specifically during the college experience, lead to status uncertainty among ethnic minority students? So that brings me to our conceptual model. And the first concept that we investigated as a predictor of status uncertainty is university fit. We hypothesized that university fit would negatively predict status uncertainty because a lack of fit challenges the social identity aspect of status-based identity, specifically the identity as a college student. It also challenges the narrative identity aspect by highlighting the clash between norms back home and norms in college, leaving students feeling like they don't belong in either environment. This link between fit and status uncertainty is one that has been previously theorized, but has not yet been tested. We wanted to take this a step further and propose that discrimination also plays a key role in predicting status uncertainty among racial and ethnic minority students. We hypothesized that discrimination would indirectly predict status uncertainty by decreasing university fit, because it highlights that one's group membership is devalued by others in the college context. So to summarize our goals for the current study, we aim to examine what factors may lead to status uncertainty among ethnic minority college students. This study is the first to empirically test the link between university fit and status uncertainty. And we also investigate the role of discrimination experiences in predicting status uncertainty. Our participants were 274 low-income and/or first-gen Latinx college students, and we had a longitudinal design spanning their first 3 years of college. At college entry, we measured our covariates, which were objective status, including parental education, family income, and first-gen status, and we also measured subjective status. At the end of year 1, or time 1, we measured our first predictor, which was perceived discrimination. At the end of year 2, we measured our mediator, which was university fit. And at the end of both years 2 and 3, we measured status uncertainty so that we could predict changes in status uncertainty over the 3rd year of college. So before I jump into our measures, I want to talk a bit about our data analysis strategy. We used a latent variable and structural equation modeling approach to capture various aspects of discrimination and university fit. Perceived discrimination was indicated by both racial and SES specific discrimination. And university fit was indicated by both belonging and cultural mismatch. At time 1, we measured our indicators of perceived discrimination during their first year at UCSB with a 9-item racial discrimination scale, assessing how frequently students were treated unfairly because of their race or ethnicity. And we also used a single item to assess discrimination experiences due to social class. At time 2, we measured university fit with a 7-item cultural mismatch scale, measuring feelings of incompatibility with between students' backgrounds and the UCSB environment. And we also had a 5-item belonging scale assessing general feelings of belongingness. Here's the full scale for our focal variable of status uncertainty. We measured this using an 11-item scale assessing uncertainty around one's social standing. A few of the sample items were my beliefs about where I stand in society often conflict with one another. And it's often hard for me to make up my mind about things because I don't have a clear sense of my status in society. So we ran our analyses in M+, and our model had good fit. We found a significant total effect of discrimination on status uncertainty. So students who experienced more frequent discrimination also experienced increased status uncertainty over their 3rd year of college. When we look at this first link between discrimination and university fit, we found a significant negative effect such that students who experienced more frequent discrimination based on their ethnic identity or based on their status reported feeling less belonging and more cultural mismatch in the college environment. And in turn, these students who felt like they didn't belong and felt like their background wasn't understood experienced increased levels of status uncertainty over their 3rd year of college. And the direct effect of discrimination was no longer significant. Importantly, the indirect effect was significant such that students who experienced more frequent discrimination felt less fit within the university context, which in turn predicted increased uncertainty around where they stood in society. So to conclude, perceived discrimination and university fit both play important roles in predicting status uncertainty among Latinx college students. We found that perceived discrimination predicts less university fit, which in turn leads to increased status uncertainty. A limitation of the current research is that we only included low income and or first gen Latinx students in our sample. This was done because this population is especially vulnerable to discrimination and cultural mismatch. So we would expect our findings to generalize to other racial and ethnic minority college students who are also susceptible to these experiences. But it's also possible for higher income white students to experience status uncertainty, but we expect the process to look different among this population. Future research should examine interventions such as belonging interventions, as well as individual factors like the ability to integrate between one's background and the college context that may protect against status uncertainty. So thank you everyone for listening. And I'd like to thank both my advisors, Drs. Brenda Major and Diane Mackey, as well as my collaborators and lab groups for their feedback on this project. Thanks everyone.
Hey, great job, Sierra. Great presentation. If anybody has any questions, again, feel free to write it in the chat, the Q&A chat, please. That would be great. Looks like we have our first questions here. So I think this is from Brenda. Does university fit change over time?
So university fit, when we've looked at that over time, I'm not sure if it changes over time. I know that interestingly, status uncertainty at the 2 time points that we have, it does change. So students are feeling more certain as time goes on, which I think is also something interesting about this study. We only looked at the first 3 years of college. So it could be the case that students are kind of adjusting and feeling like they belong and feeling more certain about their place as time goes on. But future research should definitely look at kind of what happens after college and transitions into other environments like the workplace as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. Evan has another question. So do you have plans to investigate possible potential interventions?
So right now, our future directions, we don't have any immediate plans to look at interventions, but we do want to look at some potential individual factors that might protect against status uncertainty. So we are collecting another round of data with these same students. So at this point, they will have graduated from college. But we want to ask them about bicultural identity integration to see how well they're able to kind of harmonize between their cultures back home and the culture at UCSB to see if that moderates these effects at all, as well as looking at the reasons why they came to college in the first place. So if you're coming to college specifically with the reasons of social mobility in mind, does that kind of exacerbate these effects?
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. And I think we have time for at least one more question, maybe two. First, Kevin asks, do you think these findings would generalize to institutions with smaller Latinx communities?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I would say that I would expect these findings to generalize to those institutions and potentially even have more harmful effects, especially if we're looking at the predictors that we investigated here of discrimination experiences, as well as belonging. If they're in a community where their group is even less represented, they may be at even higher risk of experiencing discrimination and feeling like they just don't belong in their environment.
Thank you, Sarah. I think we have time for just one quick question from Chris. He said, sorry if he said this at the beginning because he came in late, but did you look at transfer students versus students who entered as freshmen?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we didn't look at that. I think that would be really interesting though. Our sample they were all incoming freshmen, but I think that that's a really important question to consider in the future because transfer students are coming in at a time where they have even a smaller group of people kind of coming in with them. And that definitely might affect these predictors of how much belonging they feel in this environment. Yeah, great question.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sierra.
Thank you.
All right. So David Sherman is going to now present the Charles McClintock Award.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce the McClintock Award winner. But before I do that, I just want to put a plug in for the Psychological and Brain Sciences Gaucho Virtual Alumni Mixer, which will be tomorrow from 4 to 5:30. So it's great to be together as a department for these types of events. Tomorrow's event will have live music, cutting edge research talks by our rising stars, faculty and graduate students, an update on the COVID-19 situations at UCSB, and a lot more. And so if I will send a link for everyone to register, if you want to learn more information about it or register, I will send that link to you all. Okay. All right. So the Charles McClintock Award recognizes a graduate student who exemplifies the qualities that were cherished in Chuck McClintock. And I'd like to quote something written by David Messick. And David Messick was another longtime member of the social psychology faculty here at UCSB. who sadly passed away last month. So this award really honors the spirit of the social psychology area and the department as a whole. So these are the words written by Dave Messick about his friend and colleague, Chuck McClintock. Chuck McClintock was the first social psychologist on the faculty and the chair of the department from 1990 to 1992. When he retired, the social personality program had grown to 7 or 8 positions and had earned international distinction. More than any other single person, Chuck McClintock guided and nurtured the development of this program. And those who were privileged to be associated with it knew that its distinctive collegiality, inclusiveness, and energy were the unique legacy of its founder, Chuck McClintock, and I would add other longtime members of the area and department, such as Dave Messick, who we remember today. Okay, so today we honor Roxy Trung, a 4th-year student in Hee-Jung Kim's Culture Lab, who is the recipient of the 2021 Chuck McClintock Award. Congratulations, Roxy. The award embodies 3 components. First is scholarship. Excellent scholarship and a solid research record. Roxy has published a number of papers as first author and has a number of others in review. She's been a terrific scholar. She is presented around the world, SPSP, the European Association of Social Psychology, the Asian Association of Social Psychology. She's quite a traveler and in fact is in her native Taiwan right now. She's also a big baseball fan and has written a great paper on baseball, and there she is in her Dodgers t-shirt. The second component is education, a commitment to education and contributing to the educational function of the program. Roxy's been an efficient, competent, and caring teaching assistant. She particularly shines as a lab instructor, evidenced by the fact that she served as the upper division labs coordinator, training and assisting other teaching assistants since 2018. And third is service, a genuine concern for others and generous contributions to the functioning of the social psychology program. Roxy has been exemplary in her service. She most recently has run the Psychological and Brain Sciences non-academic career speaker service that brought in former PhD students from around the department for Zoom talks that other graduate students attended. And these will be available for future graduate students and generations to come, showing again how the contributions she contributions of Roxy have made a lasting impact. And as her advisor, Hee-Jung Kim wrote, on a personal level, she has always been extremely helpful and supportive for her fellow graduate students. Roxy is the go-to person for many in need because she's reliable, sensible, and willing to help. The social psychology faculty are very happy to award the 2021 Chuck McClintock Award to Roxy Trung, and we wish her well in all of her future endeavors. Thank you.
All righty. Oh, okay. We have another coffee break now. So everybody, this will be a shorter one. Be back here at 1:50 for the rest of our amazing presentations. And you know, if you're still drinking coffee, I might be a little concerned. If there, you know, there's a lot of coffee for me at least. But anyway, be back here at 1:50. Found his passion for studying cognition in artificial intelligence after reading the journal article, Building Machines That Learn and Think Like People, which I'm not gonna lie, actually, when I saw that in the email, I added it to my Mendeley. I was like, oh, this looks awesome. For article, it was pretty long, but I was like, well, you know, Siobhan's a pretty smart guy, I should probably read this. His hobbies include singing, playing guitar, tennis, squash, and watching movies. To be honest, it sounds like this cohort needs to put a band together with all these musicians. Siobhan is also fluent in Tamil and knows Hindi to an extent. All right, Sharon, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Jordan. Let me just share my screen. Can you guys see my screen? Awesome. So visual reasoning is one of the more complex tasks that has represented a challenge for AI. But with the recent developments in natural language processing, there have been new model architectures and huge data sets that has led to the development of good visual reasoning agents. For instance, if you see this particular diagram on your right, you could see the description given by human and AI models of state of the art are pretty similar to each other, which means that they're doing pretty good. But despite these developments, these models fall short of humans in scenes that depicts social interactions or complex behavior. As you can see in this particular example, even though if a person does not know who Barack Obama is, they'll be able to kind of tell what's happening in the scene, like a person is trying to play a prank on another person who's trying to weigh themselves or something of that sort. But when you see the description of an AI model, you can see that it's pretty generic and it just talks about the people in the scene, and it does not capture the social interactions. So in this project, we are basically trying to see if we could leverage these agents to develop a framework to understand human visual reasoning. To this end, the goals of this project include to compare human and state-of-the-art AI agents in visual reasoning tasks for scenes that depicts complex human behaviors and social interaction. And we would also like to identify the visual cognitive bottlenecks of AI agents in complex visual reasoning. And in this particular project, we are exploring the following object detection, object recognition, hallucinations, object and spatial attention, and scene integration errors. Before even jumping into the depth of my project, I would like to give a certain motivation on why it is important to identify AI limitations relative to humans and how it informs cognitive science. Over the past decade, we have seen that assessing how AI performs relative to humans can be used as an objective measure to evaluate the complexity of a task. For instance, humans find it difficult to play chess, while it's easier for them to find their toothbrush in a bathroom. And this might lead them to conclude that chess is a more complex task than visual search. But with the development of AI that solves these both tasks, we have seen that it's easier to create an AI algorithm that can outperform humans in chess, but it's still difficult for such AI algorithms to come to the efficiency of humans in visual search. In the similar veins, for a visual reasoning task, evaluating the sources of errors in AI for complex visual reasoning might help us to identify which components in the task are more complex algorithmically or crucial for humans' proficiency in visual reasoning. And this approach and taxonomy can also be potentially applied to partition human deficits in visual reasoning into individual visual and cognitive components. So the project basically involves a scene description task where we have 46 images that depict social interactions. And the task involves collecting descriptions of scenes from both humans and AI models, and we compare their similarity. The AI model used in this particular project is Oscar, which is a state-of-the-art image captioning model. And we basically collect description for two conditions. One is the unmasked image condition, where we present an image and we collect the description of humans and Oscar, and this image is completely unaltered original one. And this is called the unmasked description condition. And for the masked descriptions, we basically manipulate the image by covering 1/3 of the region, and we once again collect descriptions from humans and Oscar, and this is called the masked description condition. So I'm just going to give you a brief description of how Oscar works. So in order for Oscar to give its captions, we basically need to give it an input image, which is fed into an object detector, which is a faster RCNN model. And this basically gives out an image region features and detected object classes. These image region features, as you can see in this particular image, are those bounding boxes that you can see. These boxes have their own, these are the image regions, and we have the features for each of this region. And we also have the class predicted by the object detector for each of these boxes. This is fed into an encoder, which is like a multi-layer transformer that are currently used a lot in natural language processing.
This is pre-trained on 6.5 million image text pairs. When you give this input, you will get the output of image text feature vector. So this is basically, you can think this feature vector as a combined representation for words and corresponding image regions in an image for the word. And this, once it's given to a decoder, which is fine-tuned for an image captioning task, you'll basically get the caption for the given input image. Now that we have a good idea of how Oscar works, let's discuss the kinds of errors that Oscars make when they perform a task, scene description task. We have explored 6 types of errors in this particular project, and we'll be discussing each of them with definitions and examples in the next few slides. So basically in detection error, we define it as the one where the object of relevance is not detected by the agent being Oscar over here. And by object of relevance, what we mean is it's the object that are mentioned in the description by humans. So for instance, in this particular example, you can see that a flashlight is being described by told by humans in their description, but it's not mentioned by Oscar in its description because it's not even detected that particular object. So here is the flashlight, and you can see that there's no bounding box that covers the flashlight in the image. In recognition error, we basically have when an object of relevance is detected but wrongly classified by the agent. And you can see here that camera is the one which is the object of relevance in this particular case. And you can see that Oscar has detected this particular region as an object, but it has wrongly classified as TV rather than an object camera. In a hallucination error, you basically have imaginary objects that are mentioned in the description, but it's not present in the scene, or it's recognized by the agent. So here you can see that in this particular image, you have all the objects detected by Oscar, but none of these objects are detected as Oscar, and even the scene does not, a frisbee, and even the scene does not have a frisbee present. So, but you can see that in the description of Oscar, there's a frisbee mentioned. So this becomes a hallucination error. In object attention errors, we basically have the object of relevance detected and recognized, but it's not mentioned in the scene description. So in this particular case, you can see that the animals are detected and it's correctly recognized as animals. But we can see that Oscar has not mentioned in its description, though humans have done it. So this becomes an object attention error. So before going into the other 2 types of errors, I'd like to briefly describe about the masking procedure. So the masking procedure, we basically have our input image for which we have our unmasked description from our agent. And once we have this, we basically cover 1/3 of the image, and we once again send it through our agent, and we get our agent's description once again. Now, what we want to do is we basically want to see what is the effect of this particular manipulation in the description. So we want to basically compare the description of humans in this case with their unmasked human description. So in order to do that, we used the help of 6 raters from VIU lab, and they basically used a 10-point scale with 1 being a lower similarity and 10 being higher similarity, and they rate the similarity of these 2 descriptions. And we average the score across these 6 raters, and we get a score of 4.73. And similarly, we covered the other 2/3 regions of the image, and we wanted to basically see how the masking affects the description, and we get the scores for those regions as well. Now that we have these scores, we'd like to create a visual representation of these mask ratings. And in order to do that, we use this particular scaling with the help of our similarity rating metric. And we basically get this kind of an heat map where we can kind of make an intuitive sense that it makes an intuitive sense because we can see that for humans, it's this particular region that is most important for them to provide the description because it has a man that holds a gun. Note that we can also do the same thing with Oscar's masked and unmasked description as well. I just gave an example here on how to do this masking with human descriptions. So now that we have an understanding of the masking procedure, let's look at the other 2 errors. So in spatial attention error, you basically have a usage of erroneous spatial region of the scene to generate the description. So by erroneous spatial region, what we mean is that it uses a spatial region that is different from what humans do. So here you can see that in this example, we have this particular image where, as we saw, the humans require the leftmost region for their description. But you can see that for the Oscar, which is our AI, it requires the middle region that is the most important for it to provide its description. And in scene integration error, we basically define it as the one where object of relevance is mentioned in the description, but the description in general does not capture the contextual integration across various elements in the scene. So you can see in this particular example, humans kind of use all three regions that is pretty much important for them to provide their description. But you can see in the case of Oscar, it's only the leftmost region that is most important for them to create their description, and this causes a scene integration error for Oscar. Now that we have looked into the error types, let's look at some of our results. The first thing that we wanted to do was to see how complex our task was and whether it was complex enough to differentiate the performance of humans and Oscar. So in order to do that, we basically tried to find the similarity of AI or Oscar's unmasked description with the ground truth descriptions that we have for our images. And we also included two other additional humans, and we compared their similarity with the ground truth unmasked description for each of our images. So we basically used 10 research assistants for this purpose. And we averaged the score across the 10 research assistants for each of the similarity ratings. And additionally for humans, we also averaged across the both humans to get their ratings. We basically found out that the humans have a significantly higher similarity to the ground truth than the Oscar's descriptions. So this implies that our data set is able to capture the limitations of Oscar. We also wanted to see if there's any correlation between the ratings of Oscar and humans for each of our data set. And we basically found out that the human-human correlation in our data set for each of our image in the ratings is quite significantly greater than 0. And you can this plot basically shows the scatter plot of the ratings of both our humans the ratings of both of our humans in each of our images in our data set. And similarly for human Oscar correlation, we did not find any significant correlation. And this might probably indicate that Oscar is not using the same kind of reasoning that humans do while providing their descriptions. Finally, we also wanted to see the errors that are made by Oscar in each of our image, and we created a color-coded representation where you can see that the first column belongs to detection, the second is recognition, hallucination, object attention, spatial attention, and scene integration. And you can see the errors that Oscar made in each of our images in our data set. Finally, we also wanted to see what is the total number of errors that Oscar made in each of our, in our data set. And we basically find that we initially thought that Oscar would have more errors in the cognitive kind of errors which belongs to the object attention, spatial attention, and scene integration errors. But it turns out that Oscar has equal number of errors in both the cognitive side and the visual side of errors. Now that we have a clear understanding of this taxonomy, we would like to see how it can be used to understand humans with cognitive deficits. So in order to do this, we proposed a framework where we, instead of having the AI agent, we replace it with a human with cognitive deficit. And we basically followed the same set of experiments. So initially we have our mass scene understanding experiment through which we'll be able to get spatial attention errors and scene integration errors. And this would be followed by the unmasked scene understanding experiment and the object detection and identification experiment, where they would have to just detect and identify certain objects in the scenes that we have in our data set. And this would give us the rest of the 4 errors that we have proposed in this taxonomy. Finally, to conclude, we have basically shown that scenes that depicts complex human behaviors or social interaction exposes the limitations of the state-of-the-art AI for scene description task. We have also developed a paradigm for which we mask regions of the scene and assess the impact on the description of visual reasoning agents. And we have also described a taxonomy of visual cognitive errors for scene understanding tasks. And as part of our future work, we'd like to design the proposed experiment for the cognitive deficit humans. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have any question for Sherwin? We'll have time for 2 questions. Okay. Nicole asked, great talk, Sherwin. What would you predict about the performance of people with cognitive deficits, for example, autism, with your masked image? I imagine that they would pay more attention to different parts of the image, and what type of mistake do you think they would more likely to make?
That's a great question. With respect to autism, I would feel that since they have less amount of attentions, so they would have a more these kinds of cognitive attention errors. So the spatial attention error or the object attention error would be something that I would think would be the most that people with autism might do. And it could also be possible that they might not be able to even detect some of these objects because it might not be too much attention grabbing. So that could also be a possibility.
Thank you. Another question is from Evan. Do you think the brain can inform AI more, or can an AI inform us more than inform us about the brain more?
I think it's kind of pretty mutual, especially at this point of time. People are trying to emulate the brain in most of the cases in in trying to get how humans do such a certain task. And especially now AI has come to a point where it's kind of important to understand. I mean, they have kind of maximized in what they could do in terms of just trying to solve the problem by their own. So they're trying to come towards neuroscience and other things. So I think it's going to be kind of mutual to see, where it's taking. It's kind of exciting, yeah.
Okay, thank you again. I'm going to hand it over to the MCs for the next speaker.
Thank you.
All righty. Okay, our next presenter is Laura Huerta Sanchez. Laura got her bachelor's in biopsychology, cognition, and neuroscience from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Probably a lot warmer here right now. She is currently working with her advisor, Karen Smolinski, on researching how exposure to drugs of abuse alters behavior and its neural underpinnings within the prefrontal cortex. This past year, she was awarded the Society for Neuroscience Trainee Professional Development Award for her excellence in research. Congratulations! I didn't tell you when you got it. That is what outside of academia, Laura has a passion for taking care of houseplants. If it wasn't such an expensive hobby and she didn't enjoy research as much as she does, she would love to be a stay-at-home plant mom. So if any of you are going out of town now that the pandemic is kind of going down and need someone to watch your plant babies, it sounds like Laura should be your first call. Laura, the floor is yours.
Laura, oh, perfect.
Yeah, I was muted, sorry. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I will be giving my Minicon talk on the effects of inhibiting AMPA and NMDA glutamate receptors and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex on sucrose self-administration. Nope. Okay. So the incubation of craving is the term coined to describe a phenomenon where there is a cue elicited craving that intensifies during protracted withdrawal. And this is a phenomenon that has been shown in both drug addicts and in animal models of addiction. Here in the left, the figure from Wang et al. 2013 is a study where drug addicts were asked to rate their cravings to either a meth cue, which can be seen in black, or a NutriCue, which can be seen in white, over the period of time that they're abstinent. As you can see, that ranges from around 6 days up to a year. And as the time progresses, you can see that the ratings of craving do increase over time, peaking at around 3 months. And if you compare that to early withdrawal, which is like around 6 days, it is a quite significant increase in the ratings of craving to the meth cues. And this can also be seen in animal models of addiction. shown on the right, where rats were trained to self-administer cocaine, and then on certain days in their withdrawal periods, were exposed to a cue test with those cues that were previously associated with cocaine, and then they looked at their responses to these cocaine-associated cues. If you look as the withdrawal period increased, their responses to these cocaine-associated cues also did increase, showing that there is an incubation of craving here for cocaine and previously in the meth study from before for meth. Like drug craving, the incubation of craving can also happen for non-drug reinforcers like sucrose. Sucrose craving can also incubate over time. And if you look at the top figure, rats were trained to self-administer rats were trained to self-administer heroin. And then when they were tested to respond to those heroin paired cues, you can see that again over time, they do increase the number of lever pressing or the responses to those heroin paired cues. Similarly, if you look at the bottom figure, for when they were trained to self-administer sucrose, and then on certain days in withdrawal, they were asked to lever press for those sucrose paired cues, which they were trained for before. Over time, they do tend to increase their lever presses or responses to those sucrose paired cues. Previously, our lab has shown that this incubation of cocaine craving is associated with the glutamate release in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And if you look at the top two figures, we're looking at the same type of figure that show both inactive and active lever pressing for either sucrose or cocaine at 3 days withdrawal and at 30-day withdrawal. And at the bottom two figures shows the lever of cue-elicited extracellular glutamate in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex during these testing days. If you look at cocaine, you do see a very significant incubation of cocaine craving at 30-day withdrawal. If you compare it to the 3-day withdrawal, which is our early withdrawal date, and you can see that it is associated with an elevated level of cue-elicited extracellular glutamate during the 30-day withdrawal date and compared to the 3-day withdrawal date. If you look at sucrose, there is a moderate incubation of sucrose craving. There is an increased number of lever pressing for sucrose during at the 30-day mark compared to the 3-day mark. And since this study in 2016, we have replicated the study and showed a more robust incubation of sucrose. But for this study, we did just see a moderate incubation. But interestingly about this study that we did previously, you can see that at the 3-day mark, there is a lot more cue-elicited extracellular glutamate in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex compared to the 30-day mark, which is in contrast to the cocaine test that we did in this study. So this is showing that while the behavioral phenomenon may be similar, the glutamate mechanisms for sucrose seeking and cocaine seeking may be a little bit different or work differently. So this extracellular glutamate does activate a number of receptors, including ionotropic glutamate receptors. And two of these ionotropic glutamate receptor types are AMPA receptors and NMDA receptors. AMPA receptors can be composed of 4 subunits, GluA1 to GluA4, and in particular interest, the GluA2 lacking receptors are calcium permeable, and it does help a little bit with transduction and synaptic plasticity. NMDA receptors can have 7 subunits, and there's a lot of subunits for the NMDA receptors, GluN1, GluN2A to D, and then GluN3A and B. And of particular interest in our current sucrose study that I will be presenting about today, our targets are broadly AMPA receptors and NMDA receptors, and selectively our targets are GluA2 lacking AMPA receptors and GluN2A and GluN2B containing NMDA receptors. Our region of interest for the sucrose study also is the ventral medial prefrontal cortex from previous studies that we have seen, and because it has projections to many reward-related regions, this can be shown here. The ventral medial prefrontal cortex is composed of 2 different subregions, the prelimbic region and the infralimbic region, and both of them have been found to be involved in drug seeking. So our research question knowing about the incubation of sucrose craving and that the glutamate mechanisms may be different for sucrose craving compared to previous literature in cocaine craving, we asked, what are the effects of inhibiting AMPA and NMDA receptors in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex on sucrose self-administration? In order to do this, rats were implanted bilaterally using during stereotaxic surgery with my cannula. And then once the rats healed and were ready for training, they underwent sucrose self-administration training in operant chambers where if they pressed on the active lever, which was the right lever for them, they received a 20-second tone and light cue or stimulus to signal a reward. And in this case, the reward was a banana flavored sucrose pellet. If they pressed on the inactive lever, they received no cue and no reward. These tests lasted for 6 hours per session for 10 days. So they were in the operant chambers for quite a long time, just going away at getting some sugar for them. And once we were sufficiently confident that their responding for sucrose was stable, through many testing days, we micro-injected using those cannula that we implanted before different pharmaceutical compounds for our target receptors of AMPA and NMDA, and then our selective targets for AMPA and NMDA. Right after the rats were infused with their drug, they were immediately placed into the operant chamber again to perform another sucrose self-administration task that is also very similar to the one that they were trained in, except this time instead of 6 hours per session, they had 2 hours per session. If they press on the active lever, they received a 20-second tone and light stimulus to signal the reward of a banana flavored sucrose pellet. What we found was that inhibiting these ionotropic glutamate receptors did not reduce sucrose reinforcement. If you look at the top two figures for NBQX and NASPAM, these are our pharmaceutical compounds that we use to target our AMPA receptors. NBQX is our non-selective antagonist. It just inhibits all AMPA receptors in the brain area that we infuse it into. And NASPAM is our GluA2 lacking selective antagonist. If you look at the microinjected group versus the control group, we really see no group differences in active lever pressing. So we find that inhibiting ionotropic glutamate receptors did not reduce sucrose reinforcement. For our rats who received our NMDA receptor antagonist, the more selective ones at least, PPPA and TCN237, which targeted certain NMDA receptors with certain subunits, GluN2A and GluN2B respectively. We found also that there were no group differences between the microinjected group and our control groups during those testing days. However, when we microinjected DAP5, which was a non-selective NMDA receptor antagonist, we found that the microinjected group did have a significant increase in active lever pressing compared to the control group. Further, we found that inhibiting these ionotropic glutamate receptors did not affect an active lever pressing. For both AMPA receptors and NMDA receptors, when we microinjected NBQX and NASPAM again, there was no significant effect on or any group differences between the microinjected group of rats versus our control group of rats. And if we look at the rats who received the NMDA receptor antagonist for all of the pharmaceutical compounds that we microinjected, DAP5, PPPA, and TCN237, we find no group differences between our microinjected group and our control groups. So going back to our research question of what are the effects of inhibiting AMPA and NMDA receptors on the ventromedial prefrontal cortex on sucrose self-administration, we can say that based on this data, inhibiting AMPA and NMDA receptors in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex did not have any negative effects on sucrose self-administration. And it does not reduce sucrose reinforcement. So in the future, we could perhaps use these antagonists maybe for a model for cocaine craving to see maybe if there are any effects for that. And again, in the future, we would like to replicate sucrose findings, our sucrose findings with these AMPA and NMDA antagonists, but we would like to more selectively target the different subregions of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. It's composed of, again, like I said previously, I mentioned briefly, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is composed of two subregions, the prelimbic portion and the infralimbic portion. So, and they have been found to maybe have different roles in drug seeking. So maybe targeting each of these subregions can maybe have different effects. And we would also, would like to replicate it and further look at sex differences. This sucrose study looked at only males. Maybe females have a different mechanism that we're not seeing, or they will respond differently. We would also like to continue our immunoblotting studies to examine changes in NMDA and AMPA receptors in both sucrose and cocaine incubation. We have a sucrose bank where we could possibly look at these changes in these receptors a little bit more. And in the future, we'd like to use similar neuropharmacological approaches as those used in this current sucrose study to determine the role of AMPA and NMDA receptors in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex in cocaine incubation. and maybe eventually meth incubation if I ever get there. It's quite a lot of work. I would like to give a special thanks to everybody in my lab for being very supportive, and thank you to you all for listening to my talk. Do you have any questions?
Great talk, Laura. Does anyone have any questions for her? You can put that in the Q&A box. Okay, so we got a question from Evan. What's the difference between sucrose and glucose administration? Would that be affect receptor differently?
Glucose, I think, is sucrose and glucose administration. Would that be effective? I think that it would. I haven't really looked at glucose administration. There are some studies on saccharin, which is more of like a liquid sugar that you can administer. And I think those have shown a little bit of incubation, but I think most of the studies include sucrose just because sucrose pellets are so easy to get, and rats seem to really like the banana flavored sucrose pellets or even the plain old sucrose pellets. That answers your question.
Okay. Anyone have any other questions for her? Well, maybe have time for one or two questions. Are there other neurotransmitter systems that you are interested in looking at from top?
It's just kind of everybody does it kind of, but the dopaminergic system is also a reward related system. But I did find a study that combined an NMDA receptor antagonist with a D1 receptor antagonist, and that did have a big effect. So maybe doing that in the future could be something interesting to look at. Maybe infuse two different, or make a cocktail of two different antagonists could be something interesting to look at in the VMPFC.
Okay. Any other question for Laura? Okay, thank you again, Laura. I'm going to hand it over to the MCs and they'll set up for the next speaker. Thanks.
All right, so we've made it to our last presenter of the day, Connor Gibbs. Connor received his undergrad psychology degree from Westmont College here in Santa Barbara in 2019. He then came to UCSB immediately after undergrad to work with David Sherman. The two have been researching military veterans' transition to civilian employment, which we'll hear about more shortly. Connor was recently awarded the GRFP from the National Science Foundation as funding for his work. In his free time, Connor enjoys playing Dungeons and Dragons with a group of friends from undergrad. And his favorite TV shows include two classics, Community and Parks and Rec. In the words of Ron Swanson, if there were more food and fewer people, this would be a perfect party. I thought of this quote because I think it's pretty fitting for this virtual Minicon. So as Tom Haverford would say, this is another Parks and Rec reference, we're missing the requisite Minicon desserts, which is short for desserts, tray trays, which is short for entrees, Sammy's / Sandoozles / Adam Sandler's. I'll let you figure out what that is. Okay, Connor, let's wrap up this presentation portion of our foodless party. Take it away.
Thanks, Vicki. Okay. Hi, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking to you about some of my work on military veterans' transition from military service to civilian employment. I first got interested in this work because of the unique psychological situation that veterans are in during this transition. Specifically, they face a dramatic shift in their social environment after leaving the military. As most of us are probably aware, the military is a very highly structured organization with very clear rules, expectations, norms, hierarchy, etc. But in comparison, when veterans leave the military and return to civilian culture, or more specific to the present civilian work environments, oftentimes they find themselves in situations that provide them with significantly less structure, less clarity on norms, expectations, rules, etc. And so as a social psychologist, as well as an engaged citizen, I was interested in exploring the effects of this transition, not only because of the clear applied implications of this work in thinking about how some veterans may transition out of the military and find that to be particularly positive and successful, while others may find their transition to be particularly challenging or negative, but also because of the theoretical implications of this work in better understanding the psychological effects of transitioning from an environment of very high structure to an environment of comparatively lower structure. Zooming in a little bit into the domain of our current work, about 40% of veterans describe their transition out of military service and into civilian employment as either being difficult or very difficult. Likewise, in a study of over 175,000 people, veterans scored significantly lower than matched non-veterans on 47 out of 49 indicators of work satisfaction. So what both of these statistics indicate for us is that for a large portion of the veteran population, they find their transition out of military service and into civilian employment as being very challenging, and that their work outcomes can be detrimentally impacted compared to their non-veteran counterparts. So when we were considering potential reasons why a transition in environmental structure may impact veterans' workplace outcomes, we considered veterans who might be transitioning to new civilian work environments that, for example, may be very clear about the role or the job that that veteran is going to serve in their new organization, that they're very explicit about the expectations and the goals that they have for that veteran and how that veteran can achieve those goals and expectations, versus veterans who might be transitioning to civilian organizations that are less clear about the role that that veteran is going to play, or is less clear about the expectations they have for them. And so we thought about how this difference in structure may impact an outcome like occupational self-efficacy, which past work has already been shown to be associated with a greater amount of structure in one's environment. We also considered veterans who might be transitioning to new civilian employment environments where, for example, these social groups might be clearly defined and the social norms might be very explicit, versus veterans transitioning to new civilian work environments where the social groups may be less defined, maybe more fluid and dynamic, or the social norms may be less clear, and thinking about how these differences in environmental structure may impact an outcome like sense of belonging. Additionally, some preliminary work has actually already shown an association between occupational self-efficacy and a sense of belonging, in that when individuals feel like they're able to be successful and achieve their goals in their work environments, they in turn feel like they belong more in that environment. So ultimately, the model that we were interested in exploring was how veterans' perceptions of the amount of structure in their work environments is associated with a greater sense of belonging, mediated through occupational self-efficacy. So in order to test this model, we first conducted a correlational study with military veterans. We sampled 340 US military veterans from MTURC and Prolific. And it's important to acknowledge that for a large portion of our sample, they had spent a considerable amount of time out of military service before completing this study. On average, our sample had spent about 11 years out of military service before starting our study, meaning that for a large portion of them, the data that they were providing was retrospective in nature. So in this study, we had participants reflect back on the experiences they had at the first organization that they worked at after completing their military service. And in order to reinforce this throughout the study, we asked them to provide the initials of this first organization, which we then incorporated into subsequent items and descriptions throughout the rest of the study to continually remind our participants of the organization that they are meant to be reflecting on and considering. First, we had participants complete a measure of perceived structure in the military and a measure of perceived structure in their first civilian organization. And perhaps unsurprisingly, this sample reported that the military was significantly more structured than the first organization that they worked at after leaving the military. And again, while this isn't necessarily very surprising, it reinforces the idea that these veterans when they were transitioning out of military service were in fact experiencing a significant drop in the amount of structure they perceived there being in their work environments. From there, we had participants complete a measure of occupational self-efficacy, followed by a measure of sense of belonging. And in line with our model, we did see significant evidence of partial mediation, such that when veterans perceived greater structure in their first civilian work environments, this was associated with a greater sense of occupational self-efficacy, which in turn was associated with a greater sense of belonging. And while these results are very promising, we wanted to expand the model slightly by considering two possible moderators. First, veteran status, in that the underlying theorizing behind our work is that veterans are transitioning from a very highly structured environment, the military, to a comparatively less structured environment, their first civilian work environment. And so when we were considering how veterans may compare to a non-veteran sample that may not be experiencing such a dramatic shift in environmental structure, we predicted there may be a different pattern of results between organizational structure and our outcomes of interest. Additionally, we considered personal need for structure as a second possible moderator. Need for structure is the idea that individuals are differentially motivated to cognitively structure their world in simple and unambiguous ways. And so we predicted that to the extent individuals may have a greater need for structure, they may particularly benefit from working in an environment that provides them with greater structure. So in order to test the model with these two potential moderators, we conducted a second correlational study, this time with military veterans and non-veterans. We sampled 200 veterans and 200 non-veterans using Prolific. And once again, our veteran sample did on average spend a considerable amount of time out of service before taking our study. And just like in study one, they were asked to reflect on the first organization they worked at after completing their military service. The non-veteran sample was asked to do the same thing, except they were asked to reflect on the first organization they worked at after completing their education. In addition to the measures given in study one, in study two, these participants were also asked to complete a measure of personal need for structure. When we look at our results, we replicate findings from study one of our partial mediation. However, when we look at veteran status as a potential moderator, we fail to find evidence of moderation. There could be several reasons for this. One might be the retrospective nature of the data. Another might be that these veterans' military identities may not have been particularly salient, in that some of our underlying theorizing is that when veterans are in transition to their first civilian organization, they're comparing their experience in that organization to their experience in the military. And for this particular sample of veterans, because they had spent a considerable amount of time out of service, their military identity may not have been quite as salient as it otherwise would have been. And so in answering our questions about their experiences in their first civilian organization, the difference between those experiences and that of the military may not have been as strong. But this is still a theoretically important moderator that we would like to explore further in future studies. Now, when we turn to need for structure, however, we do see significant evidence for this being a moderator in our model. Specifically, what we see is that for individuals with a greater need for structure, the relationship between perceived organizational structure and occupational self-efficacy was significantly stronger. So in our model, what we saw was that when individuals perceived a greater amount of structure in their first civilian employment environment, that this was associated with a greater sense of occupational self-efficacy, especially for those individuals with a greater need for structure, and that this increased amount of occupational self-efficacy was in turn associated with a greater amount of sense of belonging. So in conclusion, across two correlational studies, we see that when veterans perceive a greater amount of structure in the first organization that they work at after being discharged from military service, that this is associated with a greater amount of occupational self-efficacy and in turn sense of belonging, especially for those with a greater need for structure. In two studies that we're conducting as follow-ups to these, we are conducting an experiment where we manipulate perceptions of structure in one's current organization to see how that may impact perceptions of occupational self-efficacy and sense of belonging. We're also conducting a second study where we're coding Fortune 500 company job advertisements to explore the relationship between corporate cultural signaling and veterans' perceptions of those organizations. Finally, I'd like to thank my advisor, Dr. David Sherman, as well as all my collaborators and all of you for listening today. Thank you.
Thanks, Connor, for the talk. Does anyone have any question for him? If you do, please type that in the Q&A box. Okay, so like our first question, how do you think need self-efficacy would be for people going from a civilian job to a military position?
That's a great question. We haven't necessarily considered that. I think slightly off of this, assuming that you're referring to need for structure there. Evan, I think there's essentially a little bit of work right now trying to get at whether or not being in the military actually directly impacts need for structure, or if people kind of pre-select to be in the military based off of pre-existing amounts of need for structure. So if we consider that being in the military may in fact, because of socialization and things like that, increase one's need for structure, then you may expect that when individuals move from the civilian context to the military, that may increase. However, it is still kind of an outstanding question that research is still further exploring.
Thank you. We got a second question from Kevin. Have you looked at the veterans' enjoyment or sense of satisfaction of their service in the military?
Yeah, another really great question. We haven't looked at that in these specific studies, primarily kind of building off the idea that in some ways, kind of regardless of their perceptions of their experience in the military, they are still going through similar types of socialization. However, we have begun to kind of consider reasons why individuals may be choosing to leave the military. For example, in more qualitative data that we've been collecting and kind of looking at, some veterans do talk about the desire to leave the military because it's in some ways kind of overbearingly structured, that they are in fact looking for a less structured work environment. And so while that is something that we're continuing to develop and consider in our work, at least kind of preliminarily, it seems like in general, some degree of structure does seem to be still a benefit to veterans. But that is something that we're hoping to explore further in future work.
Thank you. Wonderful talk. I'm going to hand it over to the MC.
All righty, great talk. Cool, so that concludes our talk. So I'm gonna go ahead and hand it over to the man, the myth, the legend, Barry Giesbrecht, who may or may not have promised to make homemade pizza for the presenters and the Minicon organizers. But yeah, I'm just gonna go ahead and shoot it over to Barry.
Whoa, that took a little bit. I may or may not have promised that. That's true. So Mike unfortunately had to step out for a little bit. So the first thing I want to do, and kind of echoing Diane's comment in the chat here, is I just want to congratulate a stellar group of speakers. I mean, every year it amazes me how much further the bar gets pushed up. And you all did a fantastic job today. Really incredible work, rigorous, thoughtful, and thought-provoking. So thank you for that. You should be proud of yourselves. Everyone did fantastic. I also want to take a moment and thank the planning committee, the third years who tirelessly devoted their time to putting together another great conference. So this includes Alyssa and Shu Ying, Vicky, Jordan, Courtney, Sarah, Paige, and Maymay. You all did a fantastic job. It ran very smoothly again on Zoom. Hopefully next year, the third years we'll be able to organize something in person where there will be actual coffee. Maybe Daniel will bring his new espresso machine and start pulling coffees for everyone. I will not make pizza though for everyone that day anyway. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge Chris McFerrin and Catherine Lowe for their tireless efforts every year for helping the grad students put this together, and just for being the glue that really keeps our graduate program together. Without you, our graduate program would really suffer. And so thank you for all of your hard work. And with that, on behalf of everyone, I would like to again congratulate our speakers and wish you all a great afternoon.
Thank you for those kind words, Barry. Elegant as always. Shu Ying, Alyssa, we good?
Yeah, I think we're good. So thank you, everyone, and hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.
Fantastic. Adios.
Jordan, I'll see you in like 15 minutes.
Right. Okay. Right. Evan, that was a hilarious joke, by the way. That mic drop. That is honestly one of your best jokes ever. All right. Well,
that is pretty good, Jordan.
Evan.
Evan, yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Oh, sign up.